Today we'll talk about those that tried but failed, not because they lacked quality or substance, but simply were too obscure to even get to see the limelight. And obscure games are, well, obscure. Sometimes it's because they came from small dev teams, unable to advertise them in any meaningful way, or released as a public domain titles or even as parts of cover discs to gaming mags. Sometimes because the games only ever came out in a particular country or language, and sometimes because their presentation was so severely lacking to the point of discouraging potential players to ever bother into taking a look at the game itself, at least when compared to flashy high-budget titles. Reasons for all that aside, this is the first video of yet unspecified number to cover obscure games on the Amiga, so let's get on with it. Emerald Mine 2 is a place you go to hunt for… dig for. Nope, also wrong. Fish for? No. Oh yeah, mine. Yes, mine emeralds. And Emerald Mine 2 is no different. Just 2. So that other mine, the one on the right from the one that was 1, if that makes any sense. I might be having a fever, cause even I can't follow this train of thought. Anyway, essentially speaking, Emerald Mine 2 is a Boulder Dash but considerably expanded upon. It's a top-down tile-based puzzler where you have to collect enough gems within given time limit and then get to the exit. Same as in Boulder Dash, the character you control is the only one who can actually dig through the sand. And is also the only object in the game, other than said sand and rock walls, that's immune to the gravity. Because game logic. All other objects aren't, and when they lose support or are pushed from ledges, they naturally fall down. And this is where the puzzle element comes to life. Because you will have to correctly move or drop rocks to open up areas to go through. In the same time, you'll need to make sure not to block your way with mistakenly rushed moves, as there is no pull option in the game. And mistakes are irreversible. There are also enemies in Emerald Mine's caves, clearly previous adventurers who lost their minds not being able to live and mutated over time into various monstrosities. And they can be only killed by dropping objects on them or by explosions. As opposed to Boulder Dash, Emerald Mine 2 also features collectible explosive bombs. Not that there are any other kinds of bombs. But there are also dynamite and colored keys. These last are used for opening correspondingly colored doors. It's all good and dandy, and the game is pretty fun, even if horrid looking, but where it really spreads its wings is in simultaneous two-player co-op, where you and a friend get to tackle those hard levels together. With someone else to share your frustrations with, Emerald Mine becomes a truly unforgettable experience, even today. Fatal Mission 2 kinda looks like something that was conceived in Microsoft Paint. Rough, simple, and not very eye-pleasing. Kinda like I do every morning before I have my coffee. Not that it changes much after I do, but at the very least I get to carry on with my day, for better or worse. Anyway, to give justice where it's due, despite not being a looker, there are a lot of different backgrounds and enemy designs, so even if not jaw-dropping, it's not samey and stale. Even if Fatal Mission drops the ball presentation-wise, it makes up for all its shortcomings in variety of stages, numerous weapon types and super smooth gameplay. It's surprisingly feature-rich and fun for a title that was virtually made by a group of 3 people. It's one of those titles that you don't remember about, trying to figure out the best shoot-em-ups on the Amiga, but also one that as soon as you see it somewhere, you instantly remember how criminally underrated it was. From a purely technical point of view, keeping in mind how big or small actually the development team was, it's also an interesting game because it not only runs at full 50Hz Amiga's refresh rate, so in layman's terms 50 FPS, but also features two-way hardware scrolling and super fast refresh of all 8 available hardware sprites, up to 100 times per frame, meaning that many objects can be smoothly displayed all at once. And they are. All that aside, the only thing you should really take out from what I just said is that while largely unknown, Fatal Mission 2 is a blast that sadly is only single player. The older I get and the lower my center of gravity moves, the less I wanna partake in outside physical activities like sports. Especially that I'm not too big on them. But it doesn't mean that I don't enjoy dabbling in sport-adjacent activities like management. Those who play managers, however, know very well how time-consuming and involving those games are. You gotta give them all, or otherwise your team will either fail or fail miserably. Nope, there's one more option. It can also fail terribly. Yep, that's the 3. So, if you can't, won't, or don't feel like investing way too much time but still wanna tickle that management bone, Football Masters 2.08 is the game of your choice. Or my choice. But your today's discovery. Hopefully at least, as it was supposed to be obscure games list. Anyway, Football Masters 2.08 is incredibly simplistic and down to the basics football manager. It's so basic in fact that most mobile football managers are incomparably more advanced. But that's the beauty of it. It was never intended to be in-depth filled with options and possibilities to the brim. It's as simple as they come. Pick a team, set your squad, start playing. That's it. No advertisements, prices of items, stadium expansions, nothing. You can purchase and sell players, but that's the extent of it. Even more so, there's no graphics really to speak of, as there are literally just a few small pictures during matches here and there, and everything else is laid out in text. Same could be said about sound. It's a title that focused on one and only one aspect of management: team composition and matches, and that's what it serves. Nothing less, nothing more. And good, cause it's not a game for hardcore football management fans, it's a game for football fans and those that want to dabble, want to wet one toe in the pool of management, just to get that taste of it, not necessarily to study long data-filled Excel sheets. There is also no time limit to how long you can lead your team in Football Masters, so you may very well be managing it for way over 50 years. Before I was making videos for YouTube, I was a hero vigilante, saving cats from trees, bees from the beekeepers, and ladies from boring conversations on awkward first dates. Mainly by letting them leave early and staying there alone. But I still count it as one of my superhero achievements. Same thing with Gravity Force 2 that you see on your screen now. Before it was Gravity Force 2, it was Gravity Force No Number, or simply Gravity Force. And the 2 not only was released by a totally different developer, albeit with a blessing from an original one, Kingsoft, but also had 2 in the name only to signify that it was a 2-player game only. Now, be honest, which set of facts is more interesting? The one about my awesome life-saving superhero career, or about this virtually unknown game? Ah, thanks, you shouldn't have. I know I'm the GOAT. Anyway, Gravity Force 2 is a gravity-based 1v1 shooter taking place in a series of interconnected large caves. And it's you versus another, and only one can survive it. You can use any means necessary to win, be it shooting, bombing, or just straight up shoving the enemy into the wall, thus depleting his shields and ending him. Best of all, among hundreds of stages, there are also quite a few race levels where instead of fighting you race against your opponent. Now that you know all that, let me add that Gravity Force 2 also features a built-in level editor, and virtually all variables in the game can be adjusted from weapons through ship capabilities to physics, making it one of the most player-friendly experiences in versus games. If anything can really be called friendly in a versus game. Oh, and if what you're watching here looks bland and stupid, it's only because I'm here all alone and have no one to play it with. So a 2-player only game played by one person is always going to be disappointing. Lazarus is an obscure Polish adventure platformer that's gameplay-wise kinda similar to Delphin Software's Flashback. It's obviously not on the same level, but underlying mechanics are very similar. It's a poor man's Flashback, if you will. And comparing both would not be fair, because it would be like comparing an apple to a little older, less ripe apple with teeth mark on it and a little worm sticking out. Still an apple, just not as appetizing as a fresh one lying next to it. Anyway, don't worry about the aforementioned Polish language though, as not only it's sparsely used, and all the dialogues are only one-sided, meaning you don't really have to take an active part in it, it's also largely irrelevant and understanding it is not required to complete the game. It helps here and there, but is not mandatory. You can figure it all out, I believe in you. There's plenty of solid and varied platforming in Lazarus, and quite honestly it's decent. Just when you cross that initial Polish language barrier, that is. Or ignore it, cause like I said, it's not big enough of an issue to deter from enjoying this little platformer. So, your character is armed with a gun used to dispose of various pesky creatures, and has a jetpack that can be utilized to access more remote areas. So, for jumping. The jetpack uses fuel, however, so its level has to be kept in mind before attempting to cross larger distances. Oh, and even though you've probably noticed already, and I failed to mention it till now, but both graphics and sound design are pretty good, so they only make the game even more enjoyable. Heartlight lights up my heart, mainly with feelings of anger, frustration and powerlessness, not necessarily in that order. And not because it sucks, on the contrary. It's awesome, and it's actually the only game in this list of Obscurity, trademark pending, that I consider as one of my absolute faves on the Amiga. But I suck at it. Big time. Doesn't stop me from playing though, and it's a true hidden gem. That said, other than myself, I know of only one other person who'd played it. And it's a tragedy. Tragedy, I say. Because Heartlight is one of the best Boulder Dash-like games ever made. Period. It is infinitely more difficult than BD though, so should only be approached on days that you're absolutely at approximately 100%. Mentally, that is. I usually wake up either at 5 or 95%, and I can't really ever tell what my morning's going to be before I actually get up. So I like to think of my days as Schrodinger's days, same as his cat was. They can be both great and crap, and what they are I get to learn upon waking up, when I can observe the degree of my mental devastation. So not every day is a Heartlight day for me. Anyway, coming back to it, it's another, and I swear last, entirely Polish game in this video. But unlike Lazarus, there's virtually nothing here to read all throughout, so it's even more irrelevant than it was there. And anyone should be able to enjoy it to their heart's content. Awful pun intended. Heartlight's built-in levels are much more demanding and strategic than those of Boulder Dash, so get used to repeating some of those later stages a lot. The best part of it though is that it includes a text-based editor, or actually a text file with all the levels in it, and you can easily add your own, by typing them into that file. Which in terms of added goodness is a pile of crispy bacon bits on a bed of fried bacon wrapped in more fried bacon, all glazed with bacon flavored sauce. So, heavenly goodness. No, baconly goodness. But I gotta be honest here with you guys. Well, I don't really, but I will. It's not all sunshine and rainbows here. Heartlight's controls are very sensitive and require either a decent joystick or some tinkering under emulation to not feel as if controls are cheating you out of your progress. Keep that in mind. As looks go, I'm not great. I'm somewhere in the middle of the road. Not too handsome, but also not painfully ugly to look at. A definition of average. And I mention it because this, our next title, Lepani, however you wanna pronounce it, is in a similar boat. I'm gonna call it Lepani. Well, Lepani is maybe tad bit below average, but same ballpark. It's not a graphically good game, whichever way you look at it, but it's also not discouragingly ugly. The presentation's just there, and that's pretty much it. Fortunately, it's hardly ever graphics that make the game, and Lepani is one of the most unusual puzzle platformers I've seen. It's a mixture of The Lost Vikings with, I don't know, Boulder Dash and Puyo Puyo maybe? It's hard to explain. But basically, you're presented with a one-screen level, and it's worth to mention that there's over 100 of these, and you have to get each of your 3 characters to the exit that corresponds to their colors. Simply put, each have their own point of extraction. But doing so may sound easier than it's actually done, because very often exits have to either be first unlocked or pathway to them prepared by either removing colored stones by pairing them like in Puyo Puyo, or by enabling platforms for heroes to walk by stepping on activation plates. And since many of the levels can only be completed in a certain order, it's worth to pre-plan your moves before actually taking them, at the very least the first few. Lepani is a fun and demanding, and will definitely put that puzzling bone of yours to the test. Remember when Sensible Software coined the phrase "war has never been so much fun"? Okay, now forget about it, because this game has nothing to do with war. But one would argue that for the first 10-15 minutes of Sensible Massacre, a game that you're watching now, it could be said that football has never been so much fun. Especially for those like myself, whose physical prowess keeps declining with each passing year, in direct proportion to my desire to go out and actually partake in any sporting activities, which is now trailing 0. Why it's fun for the first 10-15 minutes only, you may wonder? Well, while the game is quite fun in short action-packed bursts, it seriously lacks in longevity department. It's a pick-up-and-play type of game, where it's enough to launch it once every couple of years just to blow off some steam, and then you're fine with completely forgetting about it for another year or two. But that's its charm, and I suppose that's why it was made the way it was. Anyway, it's match time, and you're English national team's goalkeeper, and Holland is storming your half. Literally. Running as if there were mile-long queues for the toilet, and there's only one of these in a working condition, and all the players have explosive diarrhea. And if not that, then at the very least gates of Jurassic Park had been opened, and T-Rexes are running rampart. Or, McDonald's brought back McRibs once more, and everyone just heard about it. And you know you don't wanna miss that bad boy when it's there. Well, it's not the case though, and they just run. Simple as that. And your job is to stop them. You're armed with seemingly endless number of explosive soccer balls, and have to aim and shoot them at passing players. After each half, score is counted up and displayed as a number of players from Holland that passed you, opposed to number that were stopped. It's clear by what you see on the screen that the game is pretty brutal and aimed at older audience. Given its repetitive nature, however, it literally provides a quarter of an hour of fun at most per sitting. I love turn-based tactics games. Doesn't mean that I'm great at them, but I love them. Same as with cooking. I love it, but half of the time what I end up with can be just barely classified as food. And often looks like something that you pour down the pipes to descale them. Smells like that as well, but what can I say? I like to experiment. Anyway, games like XCOM or Jagged Alliance are my bread and butter and titles that I can easily sink the most hours in. So I usually try to keep an eye on new releases, and always have. For some reason, however, I never even heard of Task Force. It was so obscure that no news of its existence ever crossed my doorway. Until today, that is. Task Force is an overhead view turn-based squad tactical game that's not unlike Saber Team or Laser Squad. More similar to the latter, in fact. And while these two were quite popular back when they released, I wasn't alone in my situation and hardly anyone heard of Task Force. It's difficult to tell why, But if I'd have to guess, I'd bet that the reason may have been the fact that it was a public domain title and not as advertised or available as games backed by big companies were. Task Force consists of 4 missions, and like in all games in a genre, before you attempt to beat them, you have to gear up and arm your soldiers to the teeth. Each turn is divided into 2 phases. In first, you move all your characters using their individual movement points, and when they're all relocated, you switch into shooting phase. Here, as the name suggests, all your soldiers that can actually attack can be ordered to do just that. After that, it's computer's turn, and it follows the same rules. Task Force obviously lacks the polish of bigger, similar games, but in the same time, if you consider the fact that there were literally 2 people involved in its creation, the end result is a marvel and a pretty innovative game to spend an afternoon at. If you like turn-based tactics, that is. What if I told you that the first building blocks of what was to become Marvel Cinematic Universe were laid out in 1994 on Amiga? No less in a superhero-titled action-packed platformer, The Unusual Case of Doctor Strange. Well, I suppose you told me I'm full of it, as by the time we got to this point in the video, it's clear that the game is not at all about Marvel's Doctor Strange. And this is what I get for trying to be entertaining. Slander. I'm calling my lawyer, so you make sure to have that wallet of yours ready to pay out. Big time. In the meantime, let me tell you what this Doctor Strange is about. In essence, it's a 9 level strong Space Panic clone where you have to get to the exit in each stage, but to do so you need to clear out all the bodies running around it first. And you do so by digging holes in platforms, and then when they eventually get trapped in them, hanging by their tiny sticky tentacles, you bash them with your shovel till they fall through, and as a result of that they drop dead falling from a height. After level 9 the game carries on, but repeats the levels in an infinite loop. So the replayability is only based on scoring as many points as possible after the first 9 are completed. And while it may not sound like much, Doctor Strange is quite fun, so doing a loop or 2 every now and then is quite entertaining. You should definitely give it a go. To say that Burton Bird is unusual for the platformer would be an understatement. Apart from the goal of each level, which is nothing special, to collect a certain number of fruit, everything in Burton Bird is a little different from other games in the genre. For one, Burton moves in the direction you point him to indefinitely, until he hits an obstacle or you change that direction yourself, or until he dies. Well, it's an unusual control mechanic and definitely one that requires getting used to, but when you do, the game ends up being quite fun and rewarding. Levels, especially later ones, are real well designed and may require a bit of planning for completion at times, which is pretty cool for those who also like puzzlers. Burton Bird features special blocks that allow movement in just one direction through them, and different enemies with various movement patterns and behaviors. Unlike most other games in the genre that would require you to either play from the beginning on each game restart or use long and convoluted password systems, Burton Bird saves your progress after each and every level, so you're good on that front. It's a unique and not too well known game that definitely deserves more spotlight, even if it's going to be now, more than 25 years after it released originally. Mid to late 90s were the time when most Western developers dropped Amiga support and focused on platforms that still had some potential life behind them. Not all regions are the same though, and in countries like Poland, Amiga was not only still a viable gaming platform, but also one devs kept releasing new titles for. Cyberforce is an excellent example of such game. At first glance, it may look like a flashback clone with the side view platforming and a similar plethora of moves, but besides some superficial similarities, it's an entirely different game. The game is in Polish only, but can be enjoyed even if you have no knowledge of the language whatsoever. It's helpful to understand it, but not necessary. Story-wise, a certain doctor predicts the end of the world in a nuclear war, and surprise surprise, he's right. And the world as we know it does in fact end. Said doctor however managed to save his mind in a crystal, and years later you, a cyborg going by the very original and creative name of Cybus, will have to transfer the doctor's mind to another cyborg body so that he could live again. And to do so you'll need to travel through quite a few levels, solving puzzles and destroying various enemies. Cyberforce is an interesting title and one that had a lot of potential. Potential that was never fulfilled because of it releasing only in Polish, on a system that was long pronounced dead, and with some really annoying design issues. First being controls, which are pretty stiff and require a lot of patience and time to get used to, and second, the combat is entirely unforgiving. If you're knocked down, it's really hard to get back up and keep fighting. Not to mention that the ammo and energy pickups are pretty scarce. Bob's Bad Day is a definition of an obscure hidden gem. I knew nothing of it before it's been mentioned on Lemon Amiga forums, and none of my friends heard about it either. And yet, it somehow manages to have 52 votes on Lemon Amiga. Go figure. Anyway, it's a top-down action puzzler with level manipulation as a main means of traversal. Meaning that you rotate the level around your character, Bob, as he remains dead set in the middle of the screen, with levels rotating around him. It's a pretty neat graphical effect, similar to Mode 7 available on SNES, and works surprisingly smooth on the Amiga. There are 100 levels to beat, and as you progress through them, different power-ups will be introduced, like heavy or bouncy mode, gravity alterations, thrust and others. This and variety in level design keep the game fresh and fun all throughout. Despite the simple graphics and sound, Bob's Bad Day is pretty addictive even if it's a bit uneven in its difficulty level curve, where some levels are considerably more demanding than those before or after, seemingly for no reason, as if they were just all created at once and added one after another without setting them up on a proper growing curve. Benefactor is one of the best exclusives for the Amiga and sadly also one of the lesser known titles. It's a very unique puzzle platformer that's a mixture of Lemmings and Sleepwalker. Sounds odd, but it's so well executed and designed that you won't stop playing even for a minute to ponder about it. You control a small character, whose name is a wordplay on the title, Ben E. Factor, and he has to save red tiny creatures from captivity that they're victims of. Each level poses a different logical and platforming challenge, and you have to use both your agility and those tiny red creatures to solve them. Little fellas can be tossed higher than you could ever jump, cross short paths that you would never fit through, even if you'd lose those few extra pounds that you carry, and they can be used to turn on and off various omnipresent switches and help in many other ways. They're like lemmings without pre-assigned skills and just do what's required where it's required, if placed on the right path. Benefactor was clearly a high-budget, high-quality game that had a lot of thought behind it, so I will never understand why it failed to gain wider audience and recognition, especially that it was designed by DICE and published by Psygnosis, two giants of the industry and companies that most players knew very well and appreciated most of the games they were behind. But such is life, I suppose. If there is only one game in today's video that you have time for, definitely go for Benefactor. If there was one fictional TV series character that was so iconic it should be written into history books, it's Ron Swanson from Parks and Recreation. The man was epic, lived by his own code, and he loved bacon over anything else. Which makes perfect sense because bacon is pretty much better than anything else. But his favorite store was Food and Stuff. And every time I think of a game that you're watching, Tanks and Stuff, I think about that store and by correlation about Ron Swanson. What a legend. Tanks and Stuff is a simultaneous 4-player arcade tanks game. And it's not up to 4 players, it's always 4. If you don't have enough friends around, CPU will fill in the spots playing the way CPU does. So as best as it can, but nowhere near as good or unpredictable as a human would. But beggars can be choosers, so if you're alone you may as well play against CPU. But don't base your opinion about the game solely on that, because it was made with multiplayer in mind. In Tanks and Stuff, you're steering a tank. And stuff. If a boat can be called that, cause it's literally just a tank or a boat. Anyway, the game is played in time limit and you have to collect as many flags as possible within its confines, and more than any other player. You can however only carry up to 3 at the time, so dropping them off to secure location at your base is crucial. Especially that other tanks may try to steal them from you by destroying your vehicle and picking them up. That however is not only limited to others, and you may very well do just that too. So, as you can imagine, in multiplayer games with others, hardly anyone ever looks for and collects the flags only, and most people focus on hunting each other while picking up odd random flags here and there. It may not sound like much, but it's hella fun, provided you have someone to play it with. Snitch looks like a multiplayer snake, plays like Tron, and feels like an odd take on Deathmatch. And if that sounds like something you'd be into, then great, because it's actually really fun. Especially that up to 6 players can play it at once, 4 on joysticks and 2 on shared keyboard. Overall, with CPU playing there can be up to 10 snakes at once on the screen. The playfield is constantly being filled with walls, obstacles and traps, and obviously same as in Tron, what you have to do is destroy the opponents by making them either crash into one of the aforementioned dangers or into your snake's tail. But if that was all, it would have been just another Tron Light Cycles variant, and it's clearly not. The game features plenty different power-ups that can be both picked up during gameplay or purchased in between the games. Snitch, however, is a game best appreciated when played and not heard about, especially that it's not the easiest and learning all the best tactics and how power-ups work can take a minute. So if you like to game with your friends and would like to sample one of the simplest in its design but in the same time very deep and replayable multiplayer experience on the Amiga, definitely give Snitch a try. Now, Springtime is a surprise. Not in reality, but this game. At least for me. On so many levels, man. It's a neat little puzzle platformer with a top-down view with a pseudo 3D movement mechanic. Springtime is played on a checkerboard patterned multi-rotating play area, with each part of the board multi-hinged in a way that would allow it to rotate, often over all 3 geometrical axes, X, Y and Z. The idea here is same as in most cheap B-movies, to get to the X, cause that's where the treasure's hidden. No treasure in this game though, but you still have to get the titular spring to the X. To do so, you have to walk around the game field and rotate it appropriately, constantly thinking of it in 3D despite the viewpoint being predominantly 2D, to create a path for the spring to drop on the aforementioned X. It sounds simple, but you'll quickly realize that it's anything but, and that you have to really get those cogs under the roof working to figure out some of the more taxing levels. Especially that every attempt is timed and you have only 99 seconds to complete each stage. So you have to get in the zone, familiarize yourself with quirkiness of Springtime's inner workings to be successful. As you progress through the game, it will feature more and more new mechanics, adding special tiles that will keep your brain working and gameplay fun and long-lasting. Springtime is tremendous fun and one of the better puzzlers on the Amiga, even if it originally was just a public domain title. When Perihelion the Prophecy came out, I was 12, perhaps 13. While not a kid anymore and already heavily invested into RPGs, I wasn't prepared for Perihelion, and even though I tried approaching it numerous times, I always somehow ended up bouncing off of it and landing with another game in my disk drive. Perhaps it was the initial difficulty, or the brown-greyish tones of everything, or simply me not being mature enough to fully encompass and understand what I had been given a chance to experience. And even though now, dark, gritty and cyberpunkish aesthetics of Perihelion would be my dream world to visit in a game, I never completed it. And based on the amount of games that I'm interested in that are released yearly, chances are I never will. And that's one of my biggest failures of my personal gaming history. Still, since I've spent long enough on myself, let's talk a little about Perihelion itself. You're in charge of 6 characters whose races are odd and very intimate amalgamations of human and different animal and mechanical entities. And you have to save the realm that you live in from an evil being that's slowly materializing into your dimension, and is foretold to bring an end to it. The game is viewed from the first-person perspective when traversing, and battle sequences are top-down with a turn-based combat. Quite unique, at least for the time, was the skill leveling system that raised those that were more used faster than the others. It's one of those games that I've never seen a single negative review for, and that's definitely something worth mentioning. There's one thing that makes Super Gems special among all little-known games in this video. What, you may wonder? Well, unlike every single other game here, Super Gems was never released. In fact, we should not talk about it here because it shouldn't exist. The game's release was cancelled when its source code was stolen from the developers Keiko at a computer fair in 1992. So while it's considered a 1992's game, it in fact, in all the copies that can be found over the internet, is a bootlegged copied stolen version. Today, it bears no legal weight really, but it's an interesting fact about it, don't you think? When Her Majesty's crown jewels were stolen by a master thief, a quartet of heroes is summoned by her to recover them over 104 increasingly more difficult levels. Super Gems is a mixture of Keiko's earlier Gem X and Bomberman, with tons of power-ups and beautiful anime presentation. It also features one of the most unusual approaches to puzzlers I've ever seen. Namely, all levels can be completed by one person, or even up to 4 playing cooperatively. And you could say that there's plenty of games that allow for a simultaneous 4-player cooperation, but riddle me this. Name one that happens to be a puzzler. Exactly. Wekus the Detective, which is pronounced Wacuś actually, is a side-scrolling platformer and another of those very late Polish games to release on the Amiga. It is however another one of those that you don't need to know any Polish to enjoy it. You will miss a backstory from the intro without it, but I will brief it here for you so you're not lost. Not that a story in a platformer has ever been deep or was important in any way, but at least you'll know. A particular collectioner has been robbed of his valuable precious coins, and he asks our protagonist to recover them. That's it. Deep, right? I feel motivated already. Anyway, the game is divided into 3 big worlds. After completing each you receive a passcode so that you could restart the game from that point next time. The levels are full of environmental dangers and various enemies, and you have to either avoid or dispose of them with your pistol. There are some sporadic puzzle elements here and there, especially with figuring out how to open certain doors, but other than that, it's a pure platformer with a pretty decent graphical and sound design. It uses ham mode to display 64 colors on screen at once and offers a very fluid animation engine. Oh, and if you type in KROWKI in your game's main menu, you will unlock access to a hidden minigame. It's not groundbreaking in any way, but it's a nice addition to this already pretty good package. Stormmaster is a turn-based strategy in a very unique setting, part medieval, part sci-fi world. You are leading your country of Aeolia in an ongoing war against its neighbor, Sharkania, and your goal is straightforward, to destroy any and all enemy cities and win the war. While the strategic layer is entirely turn-based, battles are actually real-time and take place in the skies where your air fleets face those of an enemy or their air defenses. But it's not all about the battles. Well, most is, but not all. Anyway, you'll be also sending ministers all around your country to develop and industrialize the regions to help with the war effort. And you'll partake in religious ceremonies praying to increase the natural wind energy of your nation so that the winds are more favorable to you and yours. A surprisingly fun part of the game is the ability to design and prototype your own ships. Stormmaster is not your everyday strategy, it's very unique and rare, so rare in fact that I first learned about it while working on this video. And I know some of you probably knew of it already, but I went through literally couple thousands of games back then, both commercial and public domain, and never came across this one. Odd. Resolution 111, aka Hoverforce, is set in the future in the US in the city of Las Vegas, as opposed to well-known by you, Las Vegas. By 2038, when the game takes place, the crime is rampant and the law enforcement just cannot contain it all. So a new law, so-called Resolution 111, was passed, which allows convicted felons to be released from jail in return for working as bounty hunters of sorts, tracking down criminals and gang bosses. And you're one of those former prisoners. You're given a hovercraft armed with machine gun and are sent to dispose of the criminals. The game is a full 3D vehicular shooter that takes place in an open city divided into 4 areas, each of which is controlled by a different drug lord. Those drug lords obviously are not who you're faced against straight up and have to shoot your way through many of their minions first. Defeated enemies leave money and drugs behind, and the latter you collect as evidence obviously, wink wink nudge nudge. While the graphics of Resolution 111 are very simple by today's standards, they're not bad for 1990 and allow the game to run pretty smoothly. If you enjoy games like that, Hoverforce is definitely worth a look. Statix is an interesting puzzle game that's as simple in its premise as they come and yet very addictive and fun. It's basically Tetris mixed with Puyo Puyo on a balancing board. The square blocks that fall from the above have different symbols on them. If you line up 3 identical symbols, blocks with them disappear. You have to place those falling bricks on both sides of the scaleboard, making sure that it balances and doesn't lean to either of the sides too much, because if it does, it's game over. The further from the center of the scales the blocks are placed, the more dramatic they affect the balance, so it's worth making sure to even them out as good as possible. But in the same time you have to remove as many blocks as you can, as the balancing board has a very limited weight it can carry. And when there's too many of them on the board, it drops a notch, giving you less leeway with balancing and making the game overall more difficult. Statix also offers a simultaneous 2-player mode which can be played either against each other, with player whose side becomes overstocked losing, or cooperatively working together to progress further and beat more and more levels. Statix is quite fun, even if at times a tad repetitive. So if you're into logic games, give it a go, it may end up being something you might actually enjoy. Deliverance is a sequel to Stormlord that released 3 years earlier on the Amiga, and it's an 8-way scrolling action platformer. Same as in Stormlord, you have to rescue as many fairies as possible, catching them out of sky as they fall down. It's easier said than done, however, as they tend to drop in least expected places, often right into fire pits, and you have to grab them while in the same time fighting off various enemy creatures, like bats, spiders or goblins to name a few. Some might say that Deliverance is similar to Gods, but other than having comparable viewpoint and always scrolling, the games are different. Deliverance features bigger, more difficult levels and huge sprites, both for your character and enemies. Some of which, especially bosses, are so large in fact that they take considerable chunk of entire screen space. And last level switches classical platforming to your character riding the back of an undead dragon in a shoot-em-up fashion. On the flip side, Gods feels a bit more polished, as if the devs had a bit more time to complete the game and just tie in all the loose knots to offer a fully finished product. Deliverance's animation is a mixed bag, some parts are very fluid while others feel a bit choppy, as if they could use a few extra frames to help with smoothness. Overall, however, both graphics and sound design are pretty high quality and are no reason to complain whatsoever. The game originally released on 8-bit systems, but this 16-bit iteration has been remade from ground up and expanded upon, so comparing the two would serve no real purpose. Deliverance is an interesting title, especially if you like fantasy action platformers or feel like you have an afternoon to waste and can't figure out what to play. Then this is pretty good pick. Even though it was developed by Bullfrog and published by EA, Flat is mostly an unknown platformer. You play as Quiffy, a rather unusual named character, so a smaller Quiff. And while it may correspond to his haircut, there's also a more modern definition of that term that we'll not discuss here in detail. For those unfamiliar or interested, however, it can be found in Urban Dictionary. Your task in each level is to collect various pieces of litter and then get to the surface from the sewers and tunnels that you're in. and you better act fast though, as they are flooding. And you can swim through water, but only brief on the surface, so you can't stay submerged for too long. If that wasn't enough, the sewers are filled with enemies and there's even a ghost chasing you in each level. It starts moving approximately 15 seconds after you do and follows you around the sewers, copying your movements. Quiffy can walk on walls and ceilings, however, so make sure to use that skill to avoid the ghost for as long as possible, as when he gets to you, he will hurt you. Like all ghosts do, really. And who you gonna call? Ghostbusters. While you start with no weapons, 5 different can be found, picked up and used against enemy creatures, but only 1 can be carried at the time. And since we're on a subject, there are different kinds of enemies, all following their very own unique patterns of movement and most having unique skills assigned to them. When shot, they drop a heart that you can use to regain health. A very interesting aspect of Flood derives from its title, namely water physics. I'm not sure that's the right description of it though. But if not, let's call it a water behavior model that seems to direct its flow and speed of filling up of any cavities quite realistically for the time. Flood is pretty cool, I gotta say, and while I haven't seen it before working on this video, it definitely deserves a spot on my to-play list, as it looks like something that I would find fun. Megaball is a public domain game, meaning it was distributed freely in reduced format with less levels, but after registering and paying for a full version, all features are unlocked. It is also the best version of Arkanoid or Breakout on the system. And with all the levels available and extra paddle upgrades, it offered hundreds upon hundreds of hours of fun. If you've never played either, let me explain. The game is a single-screen arcade title where there are colorful bricks on top of the screen arranged in various patterns and you control the paddle at the bottom that is used to bounce the ball at the bricks to destroy them. When destroyed, they drop upgrades from time to time, which can range from simple paddle size enlargement through ability to hold the ball to mounting paddle with cannons that can shoot powerful projectiles, to name a few. The level is completed when all bricks are cleared, and you lose a life when the ball is not bounced and falls through the bottom of the screen. It's a simple but addictive mechanic pioneered by the all-time classic Arkanoid. I don't think that there are many games in the genre even today that could compare to Megaball's ingenuity. Perhaps early 2000s DX Ball on PC could, but even if that's the case, it would still leave Megaball as one of the 2 best Arkanoid clones ever made. If you like those kinds of games, Megaball is one that you should not skip. Kikoki is a computer adaptation of an ancient Japanese game of logic. It has incredibly simple rules, easy to understand and follow, but it's devilishly tough to master. The aim is to jump 1 peg over another, removing the one you jumped over for so long until you're left with just 1 peg. As you can guess, with most logic games like that, the key is to think as many steps ahead as you can. Planning your moves as a single bad one in the beginning may end up ruining the game for you many moves ahead. Kikoki is definitely not a game for everyone, because it's a mixture. On one hand, a gameplay is slow and relaxing, on another, the difficulty can render the game incredibly frustrating to some. You can reverse one move, but that's it, that one move only, and you can't go back any further. But if you're someone who likes tough logic games, it's as demanding as they come. Kikoki offers 15 differently themed game boards with different number of pieces on each. So start with the simpler, see how you feel about it before you move on to the more challenging ones. By 1995, most Western developers were releasing either their last or penultimate games on the Amiga. But the system was still very popular and with steady user base in the East, in recently independent former Eastern Bloc countries like Poland or Lithuania. And the developers there did not plan on abandoning the system anytime soon, especially that in their eyes it was still very capable and popular machine. Enter Lost in Mine, a puzzle platformer by a Polish developer Wookiesoft. At first glance it may not look like much, but looks are often deceiving. And this is the case of that exactly. It's an excellent, even if at times mind-boggling puzzler with a very simple premise at heart. All you have to do is get to the exit. Simple as that. But it's not the destination, it's the journey. And it's that journey that is what's great and challenging about it. Unlike many other games in the genre like Lemmings or Humans, you don't pick actions from a list of skills or buttons, you have to platform your way out using various installations and machines spread in strategic locations around levels. And they can be any and all mining equipment, from simple drills and lifts through harvesters to even explosives among others. Some controlled manually, other remotely at a distance. Oh, and don't get discouraged by the fact that it's in Polish, as other than on the title screen, you won't really see it anywhere else. The Misadventures of Flink is an action platformer and an excellent example of a game that is plagued by one small but very important issue. It was only ever released on CD32, short-lived and least spread out of all Commodore systems. So even if the company would not went bankrupt, the game was unlikely to gain any serious recognition based on the size of CD32's user base. All that aside, Flink is probably the best looking platformer on the Amiga. It's a beautiful game with buttersmooth animations that could easily rival, at least graphics-wise, the best releases on 16-bit consoles of the time. In fact, it was released on Sega Genesis as well. Keeping in mind that Genesis could only display 64 colors on screen at once, it made me feel that if parallax scrolling was dropped entirely to remove the extra bit planes, it would be feasible to have it running on regular and most widespread A500 in a reduced 32 color mode. And it still would look amazing. But that perhaps was just something that the developers were not keen on attempting, did not have the budget for, or were limited by an aggressive deadline. We'll never know. One way or another, if you have an access to CD32 and a copy of Flink, I wholeheartedly recommend you try it, as it's a really good title. Games like Transplant make me wonder how names for the games back in the day were conceived. I mean, it's a space shooter that feels like a mix of Asteroids and any other generic sci-fi shoot 'em up, and yet the devs decided that Transplant is a good name for it. I mean, there's gotta be a reason, right? I've no way of learning it, but it can't just be random word, can it? Maybe because it's a concoction of ideas transplanted from other games to make this odd and playable mix. Or perhaps the devs just sat at the table, wrote all the ideas down, threw them in a hat and pulled the first one. I suppose we'll never know. One way or another, Transplant is an arcade shooter in top-down 360 degrees viewpoint, where you're free to fly around the map destroying rocks and various enemies. When all objects in a particular level are destroyed, you move on to the next one. Since the movement is free, it may have been tough to locate that last small enemy somewhere in the corner of the map, so you have a radar. But unlike any other game in the genre, it's not a rectangle on the side or top of the screen, but rather dots surrounding your ship. Each dot represents one target that needs to be cleared, and its distance to your ship corresponds proportionally to real distance between the two. The game starts with 3 lives, and you can upgrade your ship or buy more lives between the levels for the money that you earned during battles. Flexibility, power and shields are the stats that can be raised through set upgrades, and each has 5 levels of quality. Rather innovatively, Transplant features a very interesting password system. When your last life is lost, you receive a password for that stage. And when you restart from that point, you not only have a full set of lives, but also all your upgrades have been sold off and you're left with the monetary equivalent to upgrade your ship. This time perhaps with another combination of those parts to not fail again. If you like shooters, check Transplant out, it's fun. PacMan 96 is an unofficial PacMan clone that was very little known because it was only ever officially released in Austria. And if you played it somewhere else, the game was either imported or got there, let's say, semi-legally. Well, whatever. In essence, it's your everyday PacMan but enhanced. For instance, some mazes feature invisible walls that are only shown when you get close to them, which may cause a bit of a panic at start when you suddenly face the wall that was just not there, until you realize that's the case with this game and just adjust your gameplay to keep them in mind. When you complete the last 30-second level, the gameplay will carry on from the first, just at raised difficulty. The game ends same as in any other PacMan clone, so when you lose your last life, you get an extra one at 20,000 points and then after at every 50,000. While this may sound like your regular PacMan with slightly updated graphics, what makes the game truly unique is a built-in level editor that allows for creation of your own mazes. So if you're a PacMan aficionado, this one's definitely not one to ignore. To simplify, AirTaxi's multiplayer acts in a different setting. Instead of prehistoric time, you operate in the future and there can be up to 5 players playing simultaneously, causing absolute mayhem on the screen, which you're sadly not going to see in this video, even though it's the most fun way of enjoying the game. Still, the basic premise prevails when you play alone and you have to pick up passengers from numbered platforms and deliver them to those that they need to get to. Successful delivery of these rewards money, but if you crash, land too hard so that you're destroyed, or fail in any other way causing their demise, you'll have to pay for those deaths, quite literally out of your pocket. And early in the game, it can be quite crippling. The further you go in the levels, the more difficult and chaotic they'll be, adding obstacles like skyscrapers, magnetic fields, wind, or even adjusted gravity in some spots, which will keep you on your toes but will also make the game more fun in multiplayer. While AK is my most favorite single-player version of the game, AirTaxi is most likely the best one to play with others. Breach is a turn-based tactical squad game in futuristic space setting. It comes pre-built with 10 missions and you go through them with a squad of usually 5 Space Marines under a command of a team leader, who is the only person on a team that gains experience and develops his stats after each successful mission. Missions may have quite varied objectives and they range from hostage rescue through crucial data retrieval to elimination of all opposing forces. All units move and act in turns using a points-based movement system, where each action or a square of movement uses a certain portion of these. Most maps are multi-leveled and include outside terrain and buildings that can have numerous stories. Additional weapons and support items like shields, medikits, and scanners can be found throughout the map, picked up and used. Interestingly enough, only aforementioned team leader develops from mission to mission, and the team for each encounter is brand new, so you could say that while missions are team-oriented, the overarching game is entirely focused on your squad leader character. If he gets killed, the game deletes his corresponding file permanently and there is no way of recovering him. So keep that in mind when attempting especially daring attacks. Additionally, Breach came with included scenario editor that can theoretically expand the game's replayability indefinitely. So yeah, that's cool. Cybersweet Plus is an extended and upgraded version of earlier equally as little known game of Cybersphere. Fundamentally it's Breakout or Arkanoid clone. That's probably only bested by Megaball on Amiga in terms of clones of the classics on the system. Same as in all other games in the genre, top of the screen is filled with colorful bricks arranged in various patterns and you're controlling the paddle on the bottom that bounces a ball to destroy them. Numerous pickups are present in the game and can spawn from destroyed blocks. Cannons, wider or more narrow paddle, extra ball and temporary floor are among many others, and this influence the gameplay and your progress considerably. Don't want to repeat myself, but also like in the original. The game is divided into several sectors, each containing a few regular levels and a couple of bonus ones that can be unlocked via special pickup. Cybersweet Plus is a treat to those who are into Arkanoid-like games and should be a fun title for others too if they don't mind the single-screen gameplay formula. Legion is a turn-based strategy with role-playing elements, or a role-playing game with strategic background. It's hard to tell. You start with 5 characters that can come from 9 different races and are described by 6 statistics: strength, energy, speed, resistance, magic and experience. You can buy gear for each of your party's members and it will increase their stats. Your team may be controlled as a whole or as individual units. The game's played in 2 modes. In first you can check and adjust your equipment between the characters, upgrade your controlled settlements and form new legions. In second you control each unit separately, traveling and experiencing the world. The game can be enjoyed in 2 ways, and while there's only 2 of them, it's surprisingly different in gameplay styles. In general, the goal is about raising your powers, and you can approach it in 2 ways. First, more peaceful, where you travel around the map, visit various towns, engage in conversations with NPCs, trade, and often pick up while meeting people, singular or even whole chains of quests. Second road to victory is through blood and tears, through combat, through spying, tax level management in your settlement, and rivalry against 3 other leaders aiming for the win. Legion never received the recognition it deserved, but I suppose it's the release date that's to blame here. While the game was of Polish origin, it came out in English, but 1996 was not a year many Amiga users were still out there looking for new titles to play. So despite its qualities, Legion was doomed from the start. Alien Fishfinger is an arcade platform shooter developed in its entirety in Blitz Basic 2 by a single person, one Mr. David Cruikshank. If by any chance you're watching this, David, and I butchered your surname, sorry. The story is simple. You're Frank Finger and you're sent off to an alien world to save the Earth from deadly unnamed aliens. You're armed with a rifle and have a grenade launcher as well, which, while great at disposing of many enemies at once, can harm you too if you launch the grenade too close to yourself, that is. Every time you kill an alien he may drop something, and if he does, it's for grabs. And it can be either weapon upgrades or letters, which when collected to spell the word extra will grant you an additional life. Interestingly enough, the game records and saves all your dead bodies from your failures, which is a nice even if unnecessary touch. While there's no music during gameplay, the sound effects are okay, even if most are heard on at least 2 MB systems. And graphics, well, they have a certain charm to them. They're dark and all characters are very small and smoothly animated. But what's really important here is that Alien Fishfinger is a blast to play. There's hardly any other games on the Amiga that are so straightforwardly fun in its purest sense. I'd argue that Alien Fishfinger is more fun than some of the so-called Amiga classics are. Snare is a single-screen arcade puzzler with over 30 levels to beat. You've no doubt noticed already that there are some obvious similarities between Snare and cult classic Boulder Dash. But in spite of that, both are distinctively different games. Your main task is to retrieve all gems from each level before the time runs out. If it does, the earthquake will destroy everything. As you grab those gems left and right, you have to avoid both deadly aliens and obstacles. Aliens come out from the generators and are always out to get you. But they move in a very predictable pattern, so outsmarting them will be a key to completing many of the stages. In some levels, skull and crossbone blocks will be present. When pushed, they turn into bombs, leaving you with just a few seconds to react and get out of the blast range. The explosion kills nearby aliens and destroys solid walls. So they are another of the level solving mechanics that you'll be utilizing often. You also come across teleports that work the way you'd expect them to. Rocks that can hide gems, switches, and clocks that extend your allotted time. Touching an alien, facing an explosion or running out of time costs you 1 of your 5 lives. Snare is not a game I knew about before, but I'm glad that I found it. Wrath of the Demon is an action arcade game with some very superficial adventure elements. The powerful evil wizard Anthrax is trying to take over the kingdom by summoning a horrifying demon that in turn floods the land with hordes of monsters that lay waste to it. You, as a protagonist of the game, decide to take it upon yourself to defeat the evil and bring peace to the land, only because you found a note next to a dead body. You know, game logic. Anyway, you begin the game horseback riding towards the evil, jumping over obstacles, collecting potions and fighting flying creatures. After that, the remaining stages will see you on foot, going after the evil and fighting various creatures and finding weapon upgrades. This part of the game is kinda similar in both gameplay and quality of graphics to Shadow of the Beast games. But while Wrath of the Demon is devilishly difficult, I always found it to be more fun than the first two Beast games. But the star of the show here is definitely graphics, which not only in the amazing intro and outro but even during gameplay are breathtaking for the time and looking as if there were many more colors on the screen than the standard 32. Even if that's not the case, the presentation is of such high quality with very well prepared and mixed palettes of colors that the feeling prevails. Toasty! Arctic Fox is a science fiction tank simulation that takes place in the far, far, far off future of 2005. The aliens have taken over Antarctica in an attempt to steal the Earth's oxygen, which sounds odd given how polluted our air is, but whatever, if they think they can take it, let them try. You, as a singular hero who's gonna save the Earth, are sent off in a new super tank codenamed Arctic Fox. And it's the absolute state-of-the-art vehicle. It has a radar and GPS. You know, kinda like your car but without radar. It's filled with landmines, guided missiles and cannon rounds to the brim, and features a whole set of screens, switches, dials and buttons I will never understand. So, you experience the world through your view screen, and that's where you also see all the enemies, on screen and on the radar. And you'll be eradicating dozens upon dozens of alien ships and their equipment with an ultimate goal of destroying their main base. Given how early Arctic Fox released in the Amiga's life, not only it's not very well known, but the overall graphical presentation for the time is just breathtaking, even if it runs as if it was given a budget of 8 FPS. Today it may not look like much, but 1986 was a year before the famous A500 released and games with this kind of presentation were not common before. Firepower is an action arcade shooter for one or even better two players, where you're steering a tank with a goal of stealing a flag from enemy base. Each map that you play on is huge and consists of at the very least two bases, so you have to find an enemy base first and then get to the flag. But as you go about doing that, you can rampage through the map destroying enemy turrets, fortifications and buildings, or more often than not avoiding being destroyed yourself. You can also shoot prisoner camps, then pick up POWs and bring them back to your base. Each 15 of them grant you an extra life. At start, the game gives you 3 tanks to choose from, and they're the standard spread that you'd expect, so one's fast but fragile, one's slow but strong, and one's somewhere in between of the other two. Each can also hold a different number of POWs. As I mentioned earlier, Firepower is best enjoyed in split-screen multiplayer, and the fact that it comes with a map editor where you and your buddy can create new maps to battle on extends the life of this little gem considerably, because the included maps are not that great. If you like classic versus shooters and have a friend to play with, it's definitely one to try out. Alpha Waves aka Continuum is an arcade exploration game with very platform-like gameplay. In fact, it's recorded in a Guinness Book of World Records as the first ever 3D platform game. The graphics are displayed in full screen, feature 6-axis controls and flat-shaded 3D presentation. Alpha Waves features 2 game modes, Emotion and Action. First named for its supposed ability to simulate different emotional centers of the brain with its use of color and music. In this mode you guide one of 6 crafts, for the lack of a better word to describe them, on a trampoline-like platforms, and each bounce on them is tiny bit higher than the previous until it reaches maximum for the platform you bounce on. Different platforms have different maximum heights. Every level out of 256 included in the game is a 3-dimensional cube with doors in the walls leading to other levels. In action mode you're also time limited, and with entry to every new level you get an extra minute for completing previous and another minute every 10,000 points. In this mode you'll also be searching for keys that open new paths for traversal, and you'll need to locate 16 crystals and 16 cubes, all the while avoiding pesky enemies that will try to knock you off your course. Some levels even feature simple puzzles to solve, like bouncing on exploding balloons to name a few, that add a lot to already pretty fun gameplay. Alpha Waves features simultaneous split-screen 2-player mode, but it's not something I'd recommend on anything than the most powerful Amigas or through emulation, as it can prove a bit slow on a basic A500. Some of you may recognize Vermeer from my 10 years of Amiga gaming series or its separate review on my channel. And yeah, that's the same game. But the fact that I spoke about it before and I love it to bits doesn't mean that it's not an obscure title, cause hardly anyone outside of Germany knows about it. So, Vermeer is the only game I'll talk about today that's not in English. It's in German only in fact, and I don't speak German. I do however know where and how to do everything in this game. It's the only game I've worked everything out in while still being a kid on my C64, without ever learning the language itself. If that doesn't speak to Vermeer's quality, I don't know what does. Anyway, Vermeer is a unique historical trading simulation that takes place in 1920s, and while it's not overly complicated, if you get into it, it's surprisingly addictive. The main goal of the game is to use 50,000 marks left by your dying uncle to recover his stolen collection of works of art. To do that, however, you have to amass much more money than the measly 50,000, so you'll partake in stock and currency trading, buying and cultivating of plantations, and art trade. And believe me when I say that the game is much more fun played as is, rather than trying to get to that ending. Up to 4 players can compete in turns, which quite honestly is the best way of experiencing Vermeer. Like I've mentioned before, I've made a whole separate review video of Vermeer on this channel showing both Amiga and C64 versions side by side. So if you're interested, there's quite a lot more detail there. Enemy Tempest of Violence is a 34-level strong side-view action-adventure game for 1 or 2 players. Each level is composed of series of single screens with no scrolling and presents you with a set of unique objectives to fulfill before the time runs out. And they can be rescuing survivors, destroying alien eggs, finding weapons, or killing certain aliens, to name a few. They are randomized though, so each playthrough of the game can mix and place them differently between the levels. While you do that, enemies in the form of various alien species will try to stop you, so you have to dispose of them. Once and for all. Mechanically speaking, and given very limited one-button controls, there's a lot that you can do in the game. You can obviously run and shoot, slide, jump up far and down, switch weapons, crouch, arm and throw grenades, pick up ammo, weapons and other items, operate various devices, enter passages, and even give instructions to other characters. You could say that Tempest of Violence is your Flashback 2.0. The most prominent feature of the game, however, are easily its lush and beautifully animated graphics. There are shadows to basically all characters in the first plane, bullet casings fly around when shooting, dead aliens lie rotting away, and there are numerous easily recognizable weapons and items for pickups. Enemy Tempest of Violence wins in both categories, looks and playability. And only the fact that it released in 1997, long after the Amiga was officially long dead, prevented it from being widely successful. As if it dropped in 1993, I could see it move serious numbers and be quite profitable for the devs and publishers. Mine Runner is an exclusive for the Amiga and one game that deserved more popularity and recognition than it ever received. Sure, the graphics are very simple, to the point of being borderline ugly and disappointing as compared to other releases of 1993, and sound design is nothing to write home about either. But the game itself more than makes up for it. If you ever played Lode Runner, you know exactly what this game is about, as it doesn't reinvent the wheel and just features a very competent Lode Runner clone formula of grabbing all treasures while avoiding enemies and sprinting for the exit, leaving hole traps behind. Rinse and repeat. But if that was it, then as you might have already guessed, the game would not be here, cause Lode Runner clone, that's virtually unchanged from the original, is nothing new under the sun. What Mine Runner does that no other games copying the famous classics don't, is simultaneous multiplayer for up to 4 players at once. Now, sadly I can't show it to you in this video, as not only I haven't got anyone to play the game with, but also there's no footage of it in multiplayer on YouTube either. So all you have to do is trust me. Grab a friend if you have one willing to play retro games and fire this little gem up, as it's a blast to play with someone. Monsters of Terror was unfortunately an AGA exclusive. I say unfortunately as it was a game that would have benefited a lot from being available on wider range of Amiga models, especially that its graphics didn't have that wow effect and might have as well been in 32 color mode. Well, whatever, devs made their bet and that's why we talk about Monsters of Terror in the Obscure Amiga Games video. Anyway, it's basically a clone, a reimagination, a newer / better version of one of my most favorite C64 games, Wizard of War. 8-bit System's original was a blast. This, with an added option of 4-player simultaneous multiplayer, could have been something of epic proportions, if it was only released for all Amigas and preferably a couple of years earlier. Monsters of Terror is a single-screen maze shooter where you and friends dispose of various enemies, cooperating or playing the way that was always most fun in Wizard of War, so against each other. It's as fun in either of the approaches that you take, so don't feel obliged to throw nasties your friends' way when playing it though. Same as in original, every now and then a stronger and faster monster will appear, and if it's killed, the next maze will feature double points. Monster of Terror is a bit slower and easier than Wizard of War was, but fortunately none of the playability was sacrificed, and it was even slightly enhanced with additional pickups popping up here and there in the maze to help in your race for points. If you have anyone to play Amiga games with, give this amazing game a chance. Deluxe PacMan is Mr. Edgar Vidgal's version of the classic arcade game. And since he's of Deluxe Galaga fame, you can bet your ass that this is a masterpiece. And it is, but it's not your everyday Pac-Man. There are quite a lot of changes to the formula that, and I say it with a full responsibility of this statement, make Pac-Man a better game. The mazes are much smaller, which forces the ghost to be constantly on your tail, making each playthrough less strategic than original, but in the same time more action-packed. And it keeps you on the edge of the seat constantly. There are also numerous bonuses that were not present in original, like speed-ups, shields, score multipliers, ghost explosions, shots and random or extra level teleports. It's, as a name correctly states, a deluxe version of the game, and one that all fans of the arcade title or Deluxe Galaga should try out, as they will feel right at home playing Deluxe PacMan. Summer Olympiad is a multi-discipline sports simulation, and I gotta say that for the time it released in, 1988, barely a year after the famous A500 was released, it offered incredibly detailed pixel-perfect graphics and an interesting viewpoint for each of the events, making you feel as if you were watching a TV transmission rather than playing a game released in the 80s. There are 5 events to compete in: skeet shooting, hurdles, fencing, triple jump and diving. Not many, and they don't seem to be connected thematically in any way other than being summer sports, and that's probably why Summer Olympiad disappeared in the sea of other multi-event sport games that in majority of cases either offered more disciplines or simply were just better. Not to say that Summer Olympiad is a bad game, but included sports are uneven, some are more fun than others, and all require a little time to get used to the controls. All put that together kept the game from ever surfacing and gaining any real popularity. Is it worth your time today? Well, it depends. If you have access to any other Olympic games released in similar time, stick to them, as chances are you'll have more or less frustrating fun. If you don't have any others, however, this can be pretty fun too against friends, where you're all placed on the same equally as odd to control difficulty curve. There are 2 games going by the name of Elf that released on the Amiga. Both were not very popular for whatever the reason, but they're miles apart in terms of quality. While the 1988's Elf is a piece of trash that should have never been released, this one, 1991 Ocean's release, is quite good. Not groundbreaking in any way, but pretty decent for the time. It's basically a flick-screen adventure platformer where you play as Cornelius the Elf, and you have to save your kidnapped love, Eliza. Opting for a flick-screen design as opposed to omnipresent in other titles' smooth scrolling was a bold choice for 1991, and probably one of the factors that led to Elf's obscurity. The closest title that I could compare Elf to would be Dizzy Games, but with much less puzzling and considerably more action and shooting. You'll collect various herbs and animals on your adventure, and they can be traded in shops for extra speed, stronger attacks, magic spells or various devices like a flying machine for instance. There are also some simple fetch quests in the game, where certain characters will task you with obtaining and bringing them specific items. On top of that, Elf keeps track of your actions, assigning you a score/rating based on them, and it will influence your game-ending scene, so it's worth considering when deciding between killing or sparing lives of non-hostile characters. Elf is unusual and a game that grows on you, meaning that at first approach it may seem much worse than it actually is, and it demands a little time investment to find its way to your heart. But if you give it time though, it may end up being something you'll actually enjoy completing. Vector Storm is something that happens when I have a bit too much curry. I'll spare you the details. That said, I don't remember ever seeing this Vector Storm advertisement anywhere. I never heard anyone talk about it, nor I've seen it anywhere for sale really. As far as I know, other than the complete lack of promotion, it seemingly was very expensive upon release, and these two may be the reasons of its hidden gem status. And it's a game that deserved more recognition. Vector Storm is a vector-based shooter very similar to earlier title Tempest, but with many enhancements. You're traveling inside what could be called tunnels or towers of various shapes, fighting off dozens upon dozens of enemies, and even encountering an occasional boss. Both graphics and sound can't be described as anything else other than basic, but that's where Vector Storm's charm lies too. It's easy to understand what's happening on the screen at all times, nothing sticks out as odd or out of place, and the gameplay itself is also very simple and addictive. It's an amazing title unlike most released at the time, focusing on fluidity of gameplay rather than the complex sprite animations. And most of all, it's just fun. Sure, it may slow down every once in a while on those slower systems, but on more modern Amigas or through emulation it runs like a charm, and is a blast to compete with someone for points. Sword of Aragon is a game that I've called Sword of Aragorn through most of my life. I suppose the choice of the name was not a mistake, and it was supposed to lure players to take interest in it using familiar to most character. Even if it was not really Aragorn, I was a victim to this naming too. Anyway, Sword of Aragon is a turn-based fantasy strategy with some light role-playing elements. You play as Duke of Alada, one of the lands of Aragon, which it seems is a kingdom and not a person. And you get to choose one of 5 available classes for your hero at the beginning of the game, and it will influence bonuses applied to your army's units. The classes are Warrior, Knight, Ranger, Priest and Mage. Through most of the game you'll be exploring uncharted areas of the kingdom, uncovering its mysteries and conquering cities on the way. You will also develop your initial town and those captured too, making sure that the economy is stable, the money is flowing in, and the citizens are safe. So you'll be taxing revenues of the city, and they come from either farming, lumber, mining, commerce or manufacturing. You'll hire troops for city garrison to protect it, you'll build fortification and recruit both heroes and armies for your conquest. The armies can be composed out of different units as well, infantry, bowmen, cavalry and mounted bowmen, all in few kinds, and the units gain experience getting better with each combat encounter they survive. Battles are turn-based and shown by isometric perspective, and all groups of units are controlled in them separately. Sword of Aragon is an unusual game that will see you turning a small city into a thriving kingdom, while mixing strategy and role-playing elements into a blend that's only complemented by the overarching story that's full of twists, turns and intrigues. It's a really fun game if you're into those slower but more rewarding strategic experiences. Backstage is a unique title that's obscure for two reasons. First of all, it's a point-and-click adventure game that only came out in German, and secondly, it's a promotional title that released to promote Guns N' Roses rock band. Now, I don't speak German and only know a few words and sentences, so everything I'll tell you here will be based on what I found about it online. It's 1993 and Axel Pols, frontman of a very popular rock band, is celebrating his success and release of a new album by organizing a radio lottery. Whomever answers 5 questions about the album gets to win a meeting with Axel himself. You, as the biggest fan of both Axel and the band, decide to win. I also decided to win the lottery last week, but so far to no avail. So, as in most point-and-click adventures, you'll be talking to many different characters and solving simple puzzles. All the while throughout the game you'll be a subject to aggressive advertising promoting so-called Life Club, a real-life buyers club for purchasing products at discounted prices. Banzai is a vertically scrolling shoot-em-up similar to Commando and Ikari Warriors, meaning that you're a lone survivor slash soldier slash Rambo type dude that goes upwards killing any and all enemies. You start armed with just a knife and a whole set of your undisputable survival skills. It's not long before you get yourself a rifle and some grenades though. Other than just fighting the enemies, you'll be avoiding incoming airstrikes, you'll wade through minefields and deep waters too. Pressing the fire button shoots, and holding it down along with joystick pushed upwards throws a grenade. Oh, and believe it or not, there's a story to this game. You play as a Japanese kamikaze pilot who survived. Talking about someone failing at their job miserably, right? Anyway, you're captured and sent off to prison camp. There you meet another prisoner, heavily wounded Tomomi Aoki, who has important information that needs to be delivered to Japanese Army Command. You decide to break out of the camp and deliver the vital war intelligence yourself. And you have only 3 days to do that. I wonder, if you had skills to break out in the first place, why only do it when you learned of the crucial strategic data and not straight away? Battlemaster is a fantasy action-adventure combat game in an isometric top-down view. An unusual combination for the time, but interesting one nonetheless. At start of the game you pick which race you'll lead between human, orc, dwarf and elf, each of them with their own strengths and weaknesses, and a class of either warrior, merchant, archer or mage. As the game carries on, you obviously get to upgrade both your leader and your companions. When you enter a new area, you have to defeat 75% of hostile forces there to be able to progress to the next. Combat can either be ranged with arrows and magic, or melee with swords and clubs among other weapons. You can always have up to 4 companions with you, who can be assigned as simple formations and given basic commands like rally, parley or travel. Some of the classes you choose rely on support of companions more than others. Battlemaster may look simple graphics-wise, but it's an interesting title at its concept and worth checking out for that if no other reason. Blobs is part lemmings, part worms and part something entirely different, and I can't put my finger what that is. At least not yet. It's a puzzle game where you have to lead a group of blobs to safety while avoiding any and all dangers by using a set of different commands that can be issued to them. All within the time limit obviously. Blobs behave identically to lemmings, so they will just happily go forwards if not directed otherwise, even if it will mean them going straight towards the eternal sleep, to put it nicely. At the bottom of the screen, same as in lemmings, there's a set of buttons, each corresponding to a particular skill that you can assign to each and every little blob. And they're quite varied too, from jump through dig to a shot that destroys obstacles in our creature's way, kinda like bazooka shot in Worms. Additionally, not all levels are straightforward start to exit, and some have objectives, like the requirement to collect a number of items on your way or destroying specific installations. More so, not all skills are available initially and some must be picked up throughout the level to use later on. I think that saying blobs is same but different to lemmings is best way to describe the game, even if it often feels much faster than lemmings do. Catchem is interesting as it's a puzzle game in action platformer's clothing. On the first glance, it looks like your typical early 90s Amiga platformer, but there's more to it than it meets the eye. You're Jeff, the zookeeper, and you have to find and catch all the animals that escape the zoo within given time limit on each level. But most animals can't be captured just willy-nilly and will require a use of a specific object scattered around the levels. And there are always few in each, and not all of them are particularly useful. Those that are though are often used to distract different kinds of animals before they can be caught. So, for instance, monkeys in the first level cannot be knocked out with a baseball bat just like that, but have to be lured with a bowl of food first, and then captured when eating from said bowl. New objects and animals are introduced with each level, and learning correct combinations is a key to success, as the only enemy in Catchem that you face is time. Kinda like in real life for most of us. We can change a lot in our lives and modify our behavior to be better, but we can't stop the time, and all we can do is make the best use out of it. Wow, that subject changed quickly, right? Anyway, Catchem, while not groundbreaking, is a pretty decent game and one worth checking out. Upon its release, Camonix Challenge, aka Final Assault, was the most graphically rich, great sounding and playable mountain climbing simulator ever. Truth be told, it may very well be to this day, as I can't recall any other game really tackling the subject. So, this 1987's title may be cream of the crop in the genre by a mere fact of having no competition at all. I may be wrong though, and something may have released in the last 30 odd years, but even if it did, it's as obscure as Camonix Challenge is. Anyway, coming back to the game, before venturing off you have to pick a route, which also works as a difficulty level choice, and then gear that you'll take with you, and it's crucial cause on an adventure like that, every kilogram counts, every pound makes a difference, and every gram may be a decisive factor in your success. So you'll be walking the gentle slope first, occasionally testing the ground and jumping over cracks, then you'll start your vertical climb, first easier on rock, then later on more challenging vertical slope. Camonix Challenge is perhaps not the most difficult or exciting game out there, but it's definitely one tackling the subject most don't. So, if you enjoy unique games, it's definitely something worth a look. Emiput Classics sounds pretty bad, looks terrible, and if I was to end it here, you'd never look at the game again. But fortunately, up to 4 players can have a time of their life playing this little gem competitively, because that's where the ingenuity of Emiput lies, in incredibly fun and addicting multiplayer. It's not as good when played alone. In essence, it's nothing more than a mini-golf game. But the creative design of all courses and very precise controls make it much more enjoyable than many high-budget titles of late 80s and early 90s. To the point that the lack of overly detailed graphics and orchestral soundtrack becomes an advantage, as they don't distract you from lining up those perfect shots and careful gauge of power that should be applied to them. Emiput Classics reminds me a lot of Minigolf on C64. They both released in the same year, but I played the C64 game first. Emiput, however, is a better game, and not only because it released on a more powerful machine, it's just superior. But if you have no access to it, Commodore's Little Systems game is quite fun too. Not sure why I mentioned C64 in a video about Amiga games, but here you go, it happened. I shall bear any and all consequences in the comments below. Galactic Warrior Rats is a multi-dimensional pest control company simulator where you... No, wrong game. Close, but not the one. In Galactic Warrior Rats, you're in control of one of 3 titular monstrosities named Einstein, Darwin and Newton. And the game itself is a multi-directional top-down shooter where you control said rats and have to save badly polluted planet of Smithon 5 by destroying its robotic defenses and the computer primed to explode it. Now, wasn't my initial description of the game one that made much more sense, even if it wasn't real? Also, who names their planet something 5? I mean, it's like we would have named all planets in our solar system Earth, with appropriate number. Which would make our planet Earth 3, come to think of it. Never mind, ignore me please, let's get on with it. Most defeated enemies drop credits that can be used to upgrade the biosphere your rat is surrounded with, or their weapons. 3 rats represent your 3 lives, and when they're all done for, it's game over. One thing worth mentioning that may not be visible on the footage is that the spheres have a certain degree of inertia, so they don't stop in a spot. Keep that in mind. German developer Talion Software is, or more likely was, well known for their beautiful games. The presentation in their titles was unparalleled and often could easily compete with similar games on the consoles. Ghost Battle is no different. It's an arcade side-scrolling platformer with incredible presentation. It features 5 different worlds, and while they are not very large, they make up for it with difficulty. Which is a little over the top if you ask me. I mean, you can choose easy, normal and hard, but in reality they're respectively hard, harder and hardest. And while the enemies that you encounter other than the bosses are fairly straightforward to dispose of, some of the environmental puzzles may be a touch challenging for a supposedly classical platformer, especially the timed ones. All that you're armed with on your adventure are the rocks, which, while being environmentally friendly and with neutral carbon footprint, is hardly deadly. And all the special weapons and items that you find along the way are either used for specific tasks or to defeat bosses who end each level. Ghost Battle features some obvious similarities to Shadow of the Beast games, but at least in my opinion it's better than the first two Beast titles. Lords of Doom is a role-playing and adventure game mixture where you're playing in first-person view and controlling a party of 4 characters. You will spend majority of the game exploring various locations of Vertig, a small desert town that's been suddenly infested by werewolves, vampires, mummies and zombies. The monsters decimated the population and seemingly they're the only ones that are left. Well, them and your group, which is composed of 2 monster hunters and 2 ordinary citizens. Your main task is to defeat all monsters and overlords of each of the horror species, freeing the town from the grasp of the undead. All the characters have their own statistics and even meters for thirst and hunger, so they have to be fed to stay alive. Combat is realized in real time, similarly to other first-person RPGs of the era, and that pretty much covers the role-playing side of the game. Adventuring one features interaction with various objects and numerous puzzles to solve. All in all, Lords of Doom is pretty unique and fun. If you enjoy RPGs that are a little more than standard underground dungeon crawlers and feature more realistic locations, this one's definitely worth a look. Or 2. One at the game, one behind your back, cause you never know, a vampire may be just there. Cavitas is an arcade action shooter not unlike in its design to earlier 8-bit titles like Caves of Nod for instance, but quite obviously 16-bit in its presentation. You're stranded on an alien planet without any means of getting home. So, using your one-man ship you must explore various gigantic in size cavern systems spread over 6 huge levels in search for a ship capable of interstellar travel. The planet you're on, however, is anything but peaceful and all manners of odd and deadly aliens live on it. They're not keen on partying with their tech just like that willy-nilly either. All the levels are divided into smaller parts using anti-blast doors that require the right key to open new areas for exploration. You are not powerless, however, and apart from your basic weapon can acquire a whole plethora of various power-ups that will come in handy in your mission. Trust me on this one. Presentation-wise, the game looks decent when compared to the best, and really nice if you keep in mind that it was a budget release and shouldn't be really set next to these. Your craft's headlight projects a beam of light that nicely illuminates otherwise dark caverns, and overall the graphics use rarely utilized on Amiga special EHB mode, allowing for 64 colors at once on the screen, or 32 colors and 32 half-brights to be precise. Still, it's a nice upgrade from standard 32. Splash screens use ham mode with 64 entirely unique ones too. It's a lot of technical mambo-jumbo to say that the presentation is very decent for a game that did not have a huge budget or corporate backing. Cavitas is pretty cool, and if you'll have a chance, you should check it out, because why not? The Light Corridor is a mixture between Pong, Breakout and an obstacle course, all rolled into one, mixed well together and presented in a first-person view. Now, imagine that there's no video footage in the background. That description wouldn't have made much sense then, now would it? Anyway, the game is composed out of 50 increasingly more difficult levels. You control a bat or a paddle, depends how you want to look at it, and you have to bounce the ball forwards, avoiding any and all obstacles on its way and lead it to the level's end. Keep in mind that these obstacles in the form of walls, barriers and later on moving and timed ones will bounce the ball back and it can come back from a different side at a different angle than it originally went in, as it had hit few items on its way, outside of the game's draw distance. And truth be told, extremely short view distance is Light Corridor's biggest issue, as it renders planning of longer combo shots impossible unless you memorize the stages already, and given the game's obscurity I doubt that anyone ever did. If the ball falls behind your paddle, you lose one of your 4 lives. There are fortunately numerous bonuses to pick up in each of the levels that make the game easier, and they can be anything from an additional randomly moving paddle to an extra life. Graphically, Light Corridor does not stun. Even if the semi-3D presentation is not too bad, it's not something you'll remember for long after playing. Sounds are a-okay and music is virtually non-existent outside of the title screen. The design and gameplay idea of Light Corridor is very unique and interesting, and if the view distance issue would be resolved, I'd swear by it saying that it deserved much more recognition than it ever had. But as it stands now, often feeling very random since you can't really see what happens to the ball beyond a certain not too far off point, I believe it got what it deserved. It's a neat concept that could have been better realized if given a bit more time or attention. Debut, a planet simulation, among other things, is just that, a planet simulation. Other than that, there's a plot and an arcade minigame linked to the game itself. The plot requires you to rid the planet of 4 megacities that are polluting it beyond belief. It's not especially difficult, so once you've rescued the inhabitants of the cities and waste them, you can focus on the simulation aspect again. The game is played from 3 viewpoints, a global one, orbital one, and detailed close-up. In the last one you get the view topography of the terrain, population and all other details that you may need. Debut is a game of balance, cause while you can, for the lack of a better word, plant humans, animals and various plants anywhere, they need to be kept in balance to form a correctly working food chain. Otherwise unpredicted things may occur. Everything you do in Debut has an outcome, be it good, bad or neutral. So even something as small as adding too many animals in a certain area may affect the atmosphere of a whole planet. You can keep it in check, however, by directly applying various chemicals like hydrogen or neon to name a few. Debut is not the easiest or most readily approachable of games, but if you give it time and enjoy unusual titles, it's definitely something that may be worth looking at. CyberCon 3. No, there was no CyberCon 1 or 2 if you wondered. Because CyberCon 3 is the name of a computer that was built with an intent of looking over the world in case of potential invasion from space, and not a third title in the series. As usual, in games such as this one, something obviously went wrong along the way and the computer figured out that the best way of keeping the world safe was to rid it of all humans. And so it did. Initially with all the humans working in the complex it was located in, and then started planning a global annihilation and manufacturing of an army of robots to do just that. You play as one of the few survivors of the complex massacre, and you aim to locate and destroy Cybercon's brainstem, and your mission's epic codename is Operation Nemesis. CyberCon 3 is a first-person 3D action adventure taking place in a huge field with over 400 unique locations complex, chock full of enemy robots. The complex itself is filled with deadly gases, so you approach it in a modern combat suit which shields you from said gases and radiation. It is kept running by feeding it power cells, for which you have 4 slots, but only 2 are powered at the beginning of the game. They're rechargeable, so you should do that whenever you get a chance. To get to the Cybercon's brain, you'll need to destroy the robots using a plasma gun, find the brain itself and solve simple puzzles along the way. Graphically for the time the game looked amazing and runs surprisingly well even on basic 1MB systems. Don't misunderstand me though, Cybercon is hardly a twitch shooter. Everything moves slowly and the action is anything but frantic. But the game is most enjoyable as a puzzle exploration title, where you experience this grim future having to survive through it and stop what's to come after. If you like 3D first-person exploration adventure games like Castle Master, you'll probably like CyberCon 2. If you don't, then better try it out in emulation first before you spend any cash on it. Toasty! Mindwalker came out in 1986, a year before the iconic A500 ever saw the light of the day. So even in terms of Amiga gaming, it's a classic. And also a title which release date caused it to stay in the realm of obscurity. It's also, for the lack of a better word, a psychedelic experience of sorts in the action platformer with puzzles clothing. Very fitting for the early Amiga if you ask me, as it was a computer originally advertised as something a real artist would dream of. With no other than Andy Warhol praising it as a groundbreaking tool for expression. Still, coming back to our game, you have to enter Patient's brain and find a way to cure him of psychosis that is threatening his life. It's a very odd and immersive experience in which you have to take form of one of 4 avatars to solve various puzzles in Patient's psyche, in the process curing him. The avatars are the bodybuilder, water nymph, mysterious wizard and the alien. The game itself is also divided in 4. Each of these stages posing a different challenge. In first, you have to lay out a path from a crystal to a special square located in the brain. And you do it by switching to appropriate avatars to connect differently colored squares. As you go about it, you'll be attacked by various enemies, which obviously have to be disposed of. The next stage is 3D first person, and you maneuver yourself in a way so that you would fall onto one of the green zones, allowing you to enter deeper into the patient's brain. In third stage, you must find a pyramid hidden in electrified maze and then bring it back to where you started from, all the while avoiding getting shocked. Finally, in the last stage, you have to figure out and put together a color cycling puzzle. Mindwalker is weird, often feeling alien-like in its design, and yet it's an interesting experience that all who like unusual games should try it out. Cubemaster is kinda like Asteroids, but not really. I mean it is, but there are a few notable differences between them. For one, you don't control a ship, but an astronaut in space, stranded alone in dark empty vastness of it. Then you can't pass through the edges of the screen to come out of the other side like in the original, but you bounce off of it, which kinda contradicts what I said about its vastness, but whatever. And you don't shoot the asteroids per se, but colorful cubes. And they come in two sizes, big and small. Shooting the larger ones will break them into smaller, but if these are not disposed of fast enough, they will reform into bigger one once again, Terminator 2 style. You can't, however, shoot all the time in all directions all at once willy-nilly, as your cannon quickly builds up heat, and when it overheats it needs some time to cool down, so it's best to aim and shoot carefully. Cubes cycle their colors over time, and each color gives them different abilities when touched. Yellow mixes up your controls, blue decreases your firepower, red depletes your shield, and grey, when shot, allows you to pass through other cubes. The green ones are the only ones that don't change color and require multiple shots to be taken down. Other than the cube drones, there are also different enemies that have no special abilities but are actively chasing you. Cube Master is not a groundbreaking game, it doesn't try to reinvent the wheel, it takes tried and tested formula and builds upon it, expanding gameplay mechanic just enough to keep it fresh, but not too much to be unrecognizable. Is it a better game than the original? No, not in the slightest, but I believe that it's one that can comfortably live next to it, and find its own niche of fans. Or it could, if it wasn't so obscure. Walker is a side-scrolling arcade shooter where you control a huge mech plowing through hundreds upon hundreds of enemy soldiers and vehicles. Unusually to all other scrolling shooters, however, the screen moves from right to left. The game consists of 4 levels, each ending with a boss and each differently themed. First is set in 1944 Berlin, second in 2019 LA, third in a very generalized and stereotypic Middle East, and last in the year 2420 during the so-called The Great War. To defeat the enemies, you have unlimited use machine guns and limited rockets. The guns overheat after constant use, however, so you have to manage your series of shots and not just hold the trigger pressed at all times. Well, the proverbial trigger, as you'll be clicking a mouse really. When your mech is destroyed, you lose a life. When all 3 are lost, the game ends. Graphically and sound-wise, especially if you have 2 MB of RAM, the game is pretty nice and sounds great. Gameplay is nothing to complain about either, apart from getting a bit repetitive more or less 2 levels in. But destroying those small couple of pixels tall enemies is very enjoyable, so it's not something that would discourage from completing this pretty short title anyway. While Walker was designed for one player where joystick is used to control the mech and mouse to shoot, it can actually be played in co-op multiplayer, where each person controls one of the 2 inputs. It may sound a bit odd, but it's surprisingly fun, especially when drinks are involved. Wicked is wicked. It's a real-time strategy with horror and occultistic theme and undertones. Unknown evil forces of darkness want to conquer and cover the earth in eternal dark. You, as a force fighting for good, have to stop them by driving them back where they came from. To do so, you have to purge clean all 12 astrological signs, each consisting of 3 levels filled with bodies. Although that's probably not the best word for them. The goal is to multiply plenty enough of your spores to overrun all evil portals before the enemy manages to overwhelm you with their spores. So you'll be shooting enemy spores to halt their growth and reduce their spread. But you also use white picked up seeds to create new, for the lack of a better word, good portals that release your spores at strategically picked spots. You have to be quick, however, as the evil guardian spits out new red spore seeds too, which if not collected in time create new evil portals. If you manage to cover all enemy portals with your spores, you win the stage and move to the next. From time to time tarot cards will appear, and when picked up they can offer positive or negative boons, and you'll need to learn to recognize which are which to be successful. Wicked is played in day and night cycles, with game being considerably more challenging during nighttime. It is also when evil guardians are invincible and can be tackled until the day arrives. Wicked is a very unusual title and can be started in one of 3 modes, focusing on strategy, action or mixed. If you've never had a chance to play it, despite how odd it seems, it's worth giving it a go. Trust me. Knights of Crystalline is one of the most impressively designed games I've ever seen. One of the most unusual too, in theme, location and what you aim to achieve in it. Millions of years ago, huge creatures many cities in size lived in the oceans. Because of their ginormous size, they had to feed constantly to survive. One of them, chasing a tiny in comparison to it whale, got wedged in a narrow canyon, and because of its size it couldn't turn and escape, so it died. Many years have passed and all that remained was a massive skeleton, lost and forgotten on the bed of a river that flowed through the canyon. Years later, many tribes carved different bones and ribs of the creature and created tribes that settled within them, each nearly entirely self-sufficient. all sustained by the dead creature's body that the whole new ecosystem created itself around of. Your goal in the game is to find a mythical Crystallion egg and hatch it. Crystallions are magical horse-like creatures that can be ridden only by those who possess enormous telepathical powers and have formed a bond with the creature. Having one as a companion is not only rare but also the highest of honors. Since you're head of your family, you will not only aim to find and connect with the Crystallion, but also have to manage your family's day-to-day life. So you'll set the spending budgets, you will buy food, clothes, books and anything that's necessary to your family's survival, all the while selling your own produce, setting price for it, making sure that you neither overcharge for it nor undercut other families. Conflict is not something you'd like to add to your list of responsibilities after all. You can invest money in expeditions to search for and find new tribes within the remains of a gigantic creature, as they become new destinations for trade routes and offer a hefty financial bonus to your family. And all that, all of what I said, even though it may already sound partly fascinating, partly overwhelming, is just the tip of an iceberg of what the game is. Knights of Crystallion is huge and deserved much more recognition than it ever received. Especially that it was entirely made by one person, Bill Williams. The game is worthy of a proper review and not just a few sentences said about it. One day, perhaps, I may take it up on myself, who knows. Let me start by saying that Monkey Business is not a good game, not in the slightest. And as you can see, it's a shoddy Donkey Kong knockoff. It largely operates the same way the original did, but it's less polished with less fluid and enjoyable gameplay loop. Why is it here then? Not because I like to include a stinker in every single one of those videos, that's not the reason. Although perhaps I should always add one terrible game to the list so that it stays fresh, unpredictable and more varied. It's something to ponder about later on though. Monkey Business is here because it's a very special game. It was released in 1985. Actually no, it wasn't. It was programmed in 1985 just after Amiga World magazine was founded, and seemingly released in 1985. Seemingly. Very short after the first Amiga 1000 saw the light of day, it was also one of the very first games Amiga World received a review copy of, and is largely considered one of, if not the first, independent of Commodore commercial Amiga game, even if there's no empirical proof of it being true or otherwise. But wait, there's more. As quick as it spawned from the netherrealm of bad games, Monkey Business disappeared into obscurity and it was basically impossible to track down for years. To the point that the last officially known copy of it was recovered in October 2018 by a member of EAB, so English Amiga Board, on a damaged disk of a little-known European cracking group. So as you see, while the game is not really worth playing anymore, if it ever was, it is still important, obscure and worth finding just to see what the very first Amiga game may have looked like, especially given its turbulent history. Wings of Death is a vertically scrolling shoot-em-up in a fantasy setting, quite unusual for the genre. You play as mage turned into a winged creature on a quest to defeat a wicked witch. And if I can add something here, the gamebox cover is something else. I have all sorts of thoughts and observations when looking at it, but I'm gonna keep them to myself. I mean, take a look at it. Anyway, given when Wings of Death was released and that it was a port from Atari ST, it's really impressive. It offers quite a few weapons to choose from, each with several upgrade levels. Every upgrade yields a more powerful version of a chosen weapon. Switching weapons, however, resets your upgrade, so it's advisable to pick the one you want to stick with as soon as possible and then keep on investing in upgrading it. During gameplay you'll be able to transform into a few different creatures, a giant eagle, a griffin and a dragon. While Wings of Death is fantasy themes, it's just its clothing, and the game is your standard shoot 'em up with all the tropes of the genre. So numerous different enemies coming down the screen in formations, and they can either be destroyed or avoided, as the missed ones don't carousel back on the screen in any way like enemies in 1942 for instance do. Interestingly enough, other than the upgrades, enemies drop downgrades from time to time too. They are marked with a skull and will either downgrade your weapon power or reduce your energy level. Each world features an end boss, and they are usually much bigger and real test of skill. While Wings of Death was never as popular as some more well-known titles that came from arcades were, it was as good if not better than most of them. And if you enjoy shooters, it's one to track down. A lido is an old English word for an open-air swimming pool or a fashionable beach resort. It's not something that I knew before researching the game. It's also not a word I ever used in any conversations I've been in or listened to. Anyway, Hillsea Lido is a game that's obscure because of how it was distributed, not because of its quality, which in fact is fantastic. Vulcan Software, the developer, never sold their games in shops, but rather advertised them in gaming mags and sold via mail order. All Vulkan Software games apart from famous Valhalla duology were entirely different in terms of theme and genre. It made for an interesting library and one worth tracking down if you're an Amiga collector. Anyway, coming back to Hilsi Lido. It's a seaside management sim not far off thematically from games like Theme Park. You start the game with £1 million and an empty beach and promenade to develop on. Your ultimate goal is obviously to earn as much money as possible, but to do so you have to create as attractive locales as you can too. So, you'll start with something simple like an eatery or a shop, you'll hire staff, set their wages, order supplies for your built attractions, and finally set up prices for your wares and services. You will also need to keep the seaside clean, so you'll hire cleaners, someone to collect the money from all your businesses, and preferably a bodyguard to keep that fellow safe and make sure that he doesn't get mugged on his way back with all the hard-earned dough. Naturally, in time some of your stalls may require repairing or maintenance, and there are people who can be paid to sort it out too. A lifeguard is always a good idea given how smart and responsible people are, right? So do it all, do it well, and keep expanding, and you're on a road to riches and to have a lot of fun playing Hilsi Lido. Mike the Magic Dragon is not a great game. It's not bad per se, but it's definitely not great. It's a single-screen platformer where you play as Mike, well, the Magic Dragon. You've been imprisoned in a castle far from home and you have to escape. In each level there are 3 letters spread out that need to be collected in the right order, forming an acronym associated with Amiga computing. And jewels, but they're just there for picking up and form nothing. Well, they may be forming Mike's retirement fund, but that's pretty much it. Collecting the letters in the right order rewards you with a key to the next level. There are however enemies that try to stop you in your tracks. Why? Nobody knows, but they're there and they really want you to never leave the castle. There are also an odd assortment of creatures ranging from ghosts to, well, tomatoes. I mean, it's video game logic, so I shouldn't be surprised, but here we are. I am. The game has an anti-camping feature, sending spiders after you if you stay in one spot for too long, so you gotta move and keep on plowing through those levels non-stop. As you go about conquering the levels or falling off the platforms, you'll find parachutes, which can break your fall. And you will fall from time to time, as some jumps are especially unforgiving and demanding pixel-perfect aim, which for some, present company included, is a bit off-putting. Mike the Magic Dragon is a game that feels like an 8-bit platformer in an early 16-bit clothing, meaning the premise and mechanics are very 8-bit-like, with limited for the time variety and design principles. And I wouldn't be surprised finding the game on C64 playing identically but with a bit less flashy presentation. So, yeah, do whatever you want with that knowledge. Personally, as much as I do enjoy my simple games on C64, I don't really dig them on a system as powerful as Amiga. Base Jumpers is an Amiga exclusive platformer, and it's best when played with others. I mean, you can play it alone, it's just not very fun. While it can be played by up to 4 players, 2 is a bare minimum to enjoy it. Each level is different building in a different geographical locale that you have to climb. Well, not really climb per se, but platform your way from the bottom to the very top in this vertically scrolling affair. As fast as you can against the clock, preferably with all your lives and energy intact. The buildings are filled with thematically appropriate enemies patrolling, and you have to either avoid them or dispose of them Mario style, jumping on their heads. While you fight your way up, certain letters may drop from enemies, and if you pick them up and arrange in the right 3-letter combinations, a bonus will be awarded. And it can be anything ranging from points through extra lives to bonus stage. When you finally reach the top, it's time to give game's titles justice and jump off of the building. Regardless of how many of you actually play the game, there's always 4 jumpers, and the CPU just takes place of these that are not human controlled. As you fall down, rapidly gaining velocity, you need to dodge flagpoles and overhangs, and avoid being pushed into them by your fellow base jumpers. Your aim is to reach the ground first intact, which in multiplayer is easier said than done and most of the fun that the game offers. If you have someone with you, it's definitely worth a playthrough, but if you don't, you may very well just skip it altogether. Bratakas is a science fiction action-adventure built on remains of overhyped project Bandersnatch, which in itself deserves a video of its own. I believe, however, that Nostalgia Nerd already covered it in his channel, and it's a bloody good watch, so make sure to go there and check it out. I'll link it in the description below. You play as Kain, a genetic engineer who developed technology for creating superior people. The government sees it as an opportunity to use it to breed supple soldiers, which really doesn't sit well with you and you refuse to assist. In retaliation, the government frames you for treason and puts a bounty on your head. When both lawful and lawless are after you, you've no choice but to flee the earth. All to find proof of your innocence and that you're being framed. To clear your name, you have to travel to a remote mining asteroid, the titular Bratakas. The inhabitants of it, however, are corrupt and often dangerous, so figuring out who will hold the information and then getting them to share with you is what you'll be doing. You can move around flick-screen world, pick up and drop objects, and talk to NPCs. They all have their own agendas and put their own interests first, so you'll have to work with them to get them to help you. While the interface is semi-modern, allowing you to pick things up, there's no easy way of giving them to anyone, so to do so, you have to drop them in vicinity of a character that's supposed to get or use them. It's a clunky solution, but it works, so I shouldn't complain too much really. Graphically, Bratakas is disappointing. Sure, it uses high-resolution mode of 640 by 200, but it doesn't display graphics in full horizontal width. Looking suspiciously, as username Mostro noticed on Lemon Amiga, like a direct port from Sinclair QL. I mean, Bratakas never released on QL, but was originally developed on it when Clive Sinclair purchased rights to Bandersnatch from then bankrupt Imagine Software, and wanted to release it on his machine. Bratakas is an interesting title to check out, but I'm not convinced that it's a good enough game to complete. Bill's Tomato Game is a puzzler very similar in its concept to Sierra's The Incredible Machine, and it's entirely mouse-driven. It is divided into a series of single-screen levels, each of them being a unique self-contained puzzle. Your objective is always to move Bill, who happens to be an anthropomorphic tomato, from left side of the screen to the right, straight onto the conveyor belt. Even though Amiga's screen is only 320 pixels wide, between where you start and where you need to get to, game drops various obstacles and dangers. Most of them with the sole purpose of squishing, crushing, cutting or otherwise destroying our little red round Bill. You can't let that happen, right? After all, Bill may be the only intelligent life form to ever evolve from a tomato, and it would be a waste if he ended up in a bottle of ketchup or Campbell's tomato soup. So, in order to complete the levels and save Bill, you have to use various tools to make sure that he gets to where he's going. And they are an electric fan, boosting Bill's movement sideways, or glide really, as it only ever works when Bill's mid-air. There's also a trampoline, which I'm not gonna explain cause that would insult your intelligence. Jack in a Box, the creepiest toy ever, is used to propel Tomato upwards, and Blocking Box that can stop Bill's movement short. The game is composed out of 10 worlds, 10 levels each, so 100 stages of puzzling fun. That said, each gadget can only be used a set number of times in each level, and you can only try and see if your plan works a limited number of times per level too. And all that while the clock is running. Bill's Tomato Game is rather demanding from the get-go, and while it's not the most difficult game out there, it doesn't really teach you to play but demand results straight up. It's interesting, but arguably not as good as aforementioned Incredible Machine. Distinctive Softwares for the sports boxing is a true gem, somewhat hidden though, as I hardly ever hear people talk about it. This however may be an issue on my side, cause when you talk to the mirror you don't usually expect it to reply, or even more so, say something genuinely new. Bad jokes aside, For the Sports Boxing is actually a 3D boxing game that, despite badly aged simple polygonal graphics, is surprisingly deep and fun. It offers an interesting career mode where you can lead your fighter through a series of fights and improve his stats between them to finally become the champion. What makes it stand out between other boxing games is how naturally the boxers move, how heavy the hits feel, and how unexpectedly spot on the collision detection is. Even if it's not the best boxing game on the Amiga, although jury's not out on this yet, it's definitely one of the most fun to play. Just give it a go, and trust me, it's worth it. Entity is an action platformer which unique selling point is definitely the protagonist, who is not a dude, frog with soft drink released powers, fish with arms or any other creature we've grown used to, but an impressively bossomed lady in skin-tight leather suit, Antemis. And while sadly this was something devs were using to lure teenage boys to buy the game, it wasn't enough. Because while Entity is decent, Flashback that came out more or less in the same time is leagues ahead of it, in terms of everything. Story, gameplay and animation. We could argue which had better graphics, with Entity's more realistic approach to it, but that's beside the point, as it's never graphics that make the game. Especially when all the animations are really jerky and leave a bad aftertaste, feeling a couple of classes worse than the presentation that encircles them. What matters really is playability, and while Entity could hardly be called boring, dropping you god knows where and sending to fight various dinosaurs and other odd creatures, Flashback is just better. Simple as that. The game is composed out of 5 big levels, each ending with an interluding short boss level, last one being the titular Entity. You start with a basic fireball shot, which soon enough with upgrades allows for shooting horizontally and diagonally upwards, and then even further changes into a scatter shot. so there's some progression to the game other than the changing backgrounds and enemies. I'm not gonna lie, although it's probably easy to figure out from what I said so far, but despite Entity being a good average platformer, I was never a fan, so I won't try to convince you to look it up. But it was not a very well known or popular title, so deserves a spot in this video nonetheless. And there is one thing about it that I actually really appreciate, that even games like Flashback didn't do. When you squat on a platform, the screen will scroll down to reveal what's below it, so jumping down with hope of finding a platform below rather than instant death is definitely not an issue with Entity. Warlock's Quest, aka Warlock, is an action side-scrolling game where you play as a wizard/sorcerer, or even better, a warlock, who's on a mission through many dark locations to find 8 magical objects that would allow him to recover a powerful magical jewel called Karna. The graphics are really minuscule, comparable in size and sprites to likes of Benefactor or Lemmings. Your character can walk left and right, jump and shoot fireballs from his staff. Shooting uses up energy, and there can never be any more shots on the screen than 2 at once. The game screen is divided into 2 horizontally, with top near half displaying all the informations like life and weapon energy and such, and bottom is again divided into displaying the play area of over and underworld. There are special passage points that allow for switching between top and bottom play layer, and these can be platforms and stairs among others, and there's also holes through which you may occasionally fall down if you're not careful. The assortment of enemies that you'll face is quite wide for a small game like that, as there are around 30 different ones, most dangerous of these only appearing in the underground layer. It is also where the most traps can be found, or really should be avoided and not found, but you get what I mean. When you touch an enemy, it depletes your life energy and consecutive touches will cost you a life. Stronger enemies take more hits but are permanently gone when killed, the weakest ones die from 1 hit but respawn often. Slain enemies may drop pickups in form of energy refills and armor bonuses among other, and should be something you keep your eyes on at all times. Someone on Lemon Amiga website called Warlock's Quest a poor man's Ghosts and Goblins, and while it's not factually correct, it's actually not that far off estimation of what it is. So yeah, if it looks like fun to you, give it a shot. You've nothing to lose really, just time. Amnios is a deeply flawed, always scrolling shoot 'em up, but let's not get ahead of things. You play as a spaceship that has to destroy 10 enemy organic planets. It's done by laying destruction to their inner organs, so heart, eyes, brain, etc. And you can do it with use of your regular multi-directional shooting laser or with special dedicated weapons. These special weapons are obtained by collecting samples of DNA and bringing them back to your fathership. Yes, you heard that right, not mothership. It then generates a power-up for you that needs to be collected when ready. Because it's fathers that are known for spawning life inside them and not mothers, right? Right. Color of deposited DNA roughly corresponds to the type of the power-up that you'll get. The levels are filled with bodies to the brim, and there are a whole plethora of different creatures from blobs of various kinds through worm-like monsters to bug-eyed nasties. And everything in between. Basically, whatever monstrosities you might have had nightmares of, they're there. All levels can be completed in 2 ways, either by saving all humans stranded on the planet Defender style and bringing them back to your fathership, or by destroying every enemy that you can find. The latter is easier said than done, as there are hundreds upon hundreds of enemies, and they're of various sizes spewing bullets left and right and chasing you constantly in this overwhelmingly hectic action shoot. When you manage to do it, however, the Guardian spawns and you need to defeat it. Fight with it is a bit underwhelming as compared to what's usually happening in the game, so there's that. Amnios is an interesting and beautifully crafted shooter that's designed in a way that seems to be made specifically to keep me away from it. There's way too much crazy action all at once on the screen, and some hits seem unavoidable, with enemies being so large and so many of them all at once. It's not a game for me. Is it one for you? Now, I believe you're gonna have to try it out and make up your own mind. The Way of the Little Dragon is a 2D fighting game clearly inspired by both Bruce Lee and his many kung fu movies. Come to think of it, there weren't that many, and I'm not sure kung fu is the term to use here, as the fighting style that he created was Jeet Kune Do, a combination that apparently more or less translates to the way of the catching fist. The similarities to the martial arts genius do not end at your character's sprite, however. The hero that you control is named Lee, and he's tasked with defeating the Tai Sai gang to save his home island. And to do that, he must defeat 8 martial arts masters that are apparently core part of the gang. While the sprites are pretty big and nicely looking, aiming for realism rather than flashy visuals, the gameplay itself, at least for me, leaves a bit to be desired. The opponents seem pretty stiff, and your selection of moves, while decent, is for the lack of a better word boring. The game, as seen on the video in the background, can nearly be completed with pretty much one attack. sort of a spinning key, if you listen without watching and wonder. The Way of the Little Dragon may be good enough to complete once, just to add it to your mental list of games that you've 100, but no more really. Oh, you don't have one of those mental lists? So it's just me? Oh well, that's a me problem it seems. Anyway, The Way of a Little Dragon can also be played in multiplayer, and while with most titles I'd say it's the preferred way of experiencing the game, I don't think so here. It's same as in single, with a difference that the two people can get bored and grow progressively uninspired by the gameplay loop. Clearly, there's been a reason for the game's obscurity. Sounds and music are quite good though, so at least there's that. Simply put, Traps and Treasures is fantastic. It may not be as big or as full of secrets and hidden passages as Super Frog, or as compulsive and random as Robocode 2, but it doesn't have to be, as it's entirely different kind of a platformer. It's not a game where you travel through huge multiple screens spanning and four-way scrolling levels, it's more linear and straightforward. You have to save your crewmates and get to the end of each level, simple as that. Now, this may sound simple, boring and perhaps repetitive, but believe me, it's anything but. Traps and Treasures is pretty difficult and requires very quick reactions, but it's also incredibly fun and rewarding. On your way you'll encounter many different pirate and marine themed enemies and obstacles, all beautifully designed and super smoothly animated. And since we're on the presentation, it's great. The game is colorful and has its own very unique graphical style that I'm not sure I've seen in other titles. Pretty cool addition is seemingly active or at least scripted music system that switches tracks in very specific situations, for instance when going underwater. The swashbuckling piratey atmosphere is spilling through the screen when playing Traps and Treasures, and for the life of me I cannot fathom a guess why it didn't get more wider recognition and popularity. But I suppose it wasn't in the cards for it. Despite that, it's definitely one of the best platformers on the Amiga and a game I enjoy coming back to, even if only to fail a couple of levels in. Breaking news. Scientists have discovered that the human genome has been getting weaker and weaker with each generation. Our days seem to be numbered and if nothing is changed, we will eventually all perish. To combat this situation, a plan has been formed. As crazy it may sound, but given the fragility of a human body, it's been decided that our brains should be transplanted into different vessels. Autonomous mechanical bodies. Now that's a plot and a half. As soon as the plan was formed, it was put to life and the first prototype spawned into existence. BioChallenge is an arcade game taking place in the distant future, and you're in control of that first prototype and sent off on a mission to check if it's good enough for the task of saving humanity. And what's better way to test it than to have it combat monstrosities sapping our intergalactic oil reserves. And since in the future, same as now, everything runs on oil, your mission is doubly important. Field testing shiny new exobodies and saving resources for the future to run those bodies on. You can squash bigger enemies by dropping platforms on them and smaller by Zool-like jump spinning. But I suppose you've noticed that already. To progress from one level to another, you need to collect 4 pieces of an amulet which drop from crushed enemies. From time to time you'll also encounter a flying cauldron that holds various bonuses like additional armor and oil capacity for your body to name a few. At the end of each level you face a boss in the form of a guardian, and this is the only part of the game where you actually get to shoot at anything. Ammo's limited though, so it's worth keeping that in mind. BioChallenge is a game I didn't understand back then as it's needlessly convoluted in its design, and to be frank, now that I do, I still don't find it too fun to play. But it seems to be liked by those 3 people in Europe and 1 in the US who knew about it, so perhaps it's an issue on my side. What's worth noting though is that the game displays more than your typical on Amiga's 32 colors. Apparently it uses so-called EHB mode for 32 colors and 32 half-bright shades at once. But I've seen mentions online that there's been some kind of other magical technical mambo-jumbo used to display quite a few more actually. Don't quote me on that though. Astaroth the Angel of Death is an action platformer. You play as Ozymandias, a man who decided to invade Angel of Death's domain and rid it of her once and for all. She's ruling over her catacomb kingdom, surrounding herself with vile minions that are more than happy to surrender their lives to protect her. Since she can only be defeated by the one that wields 9 magical talismans, Astaroth has gathered them and hid them in her catacombs. Ozymandias has to fight his way through her monster-infested Crypt realm, find the talismans, obtain their mythical powers, each of offering a different boon, and they are telekinetics, allowing you to move objects from afar, pyrokinetics, allowing to throw fireballs, telepathy, revealing where to go next and what to do, shapeshifting, that lets you change your body shape to overcome some of the environmental obstacles, levitation, enabling your use of up and down portals, transmigration, which is for all intents and purposes a teleportation, cryokinetics, that's used to kill creatures made of fire, night vision, which is self-explanatory, and finally meditation that restores some of your lost mind energy, which in games reality is your HP. And with those powers combined, you are Captain Planet. Oh, wrong video, sorry. With those great powers comes great responsibility. God damn it, wrong video again. With those newfound powers, defeating monstrosities sent by Astorath is much easier, and you must collect all 9 anyway before facing the Angel of Death herself. She is protected by 3 guardians that need to be disposed of first, a Sphinx, a 3-headed Hydra, and a demon. Eerie music, while quite unusual, is rather nice, and all sound effects in the game are solid too. Graphically it's a mixed bag, as while sprites are pretty nice and some backgrounds are Geiger-like jaw-dropping works of art, the animation sometimes leaves a bad aftertaste, looking as if it was missing several frames and jerky feeling overall. Still, it's something you'll get used to within the 256 screens the game is composed of, and while Astronaut is starting slow, in fact it's hardly a hectic game at all, but it starts especially slow. When you get through the initial stage though and get few extra powers, you'll learn to like it. Or you won't. Believe it or not, given the presentation and setting, but Bobo aka Stir Crazy is actually another one of those multi-event sports games. But with sports replaced with chores, prison cells taking place of an Olympic stadium, and heavily polished cartoon-like presentation. The game can be played by up to 6 players alternating, all trying to overcome the included challenges. But if you play alone, you take a role of a titular Bobo, an inmate sentenced for many years in prison. And as such, you'll have to find the biggest and meanest dude there, then brutally take him down to usher your dominance as soon as possible. Oh no, sorry, wrong video again. I obviously meant that you'll have to fill your days with various tasks not to lose it. And these are: a job in prison canteen, where you serve soup to other angry inmates by keeping their plates full for as long as they're willing to eat. Points there are based on how many soups you manage to serve in given time. Then there's peeling of potatoes. And it's a 3-step process. If you didn't know, pick up a potato, peel and then toss it away. Clearly, score here is based on completely peeled spots. Third event sees you helping other inmates escape prison. Not the best idea for someone who's supposed to stay there for years, as it may extend your sentence, but whatever, you do you. And you do so by moving trampoline around, allowing prisoners who jump out of their cell windows to get past the wall. The more you free, the more you score. In fourth event, you're escaping the prison yourself, running on electrical wires and jumping between them to avoid the current that would shock you. The longer you run for, the more points you'll accumulate. And finally, in the last event, you're recaptured by the police and brought back to your cell. You can't sleep though, as your cellmates are heavy snorers, so to calm them down, you have to sing lullabies to them. And when they're asleep, you must quickly get to bed and rest yourself. Points here are based actually on how long you manage to sleep for. Bobo is an unusual example of a multi-event sports game, but it's really fun and presentation is stellar for the year it came out in. So if you have someone to play games with, this one's a no-brainer. Not the person, the game. Though the person may be too. You choose who you spend your time with. Captain Blood is a game that I've never played back in the day, and just learned of it now. And I gotta say that it seems really impressive. Keep in mind, however, that everything I'll say about it is what I found online, and not something I have any even minuscule experience in. So, you're Bob Morlock, a game designer, and you just developed a new sci-fi video game set in the alien worlds. Soon enough you realized that game worlds are or become real, and somehow you found yourself on a ship within your game. And even worse, a hyperspace accident clones you multiple times. Each of those clones departs their own way, and each has a fraction of your vital fluids sustaining your life. If you're Eastern or North European, that's most likely vodka. If you're South European, it's gotta be wine. Central and West will probably say it's beer. For Japan it's sake, North Americans will swear that it's whiskey, for Africa it will be water, and Middle East will bet on oil. And as for the rest of the world, my stereotypical knowledge ends here, so I don't think I can add any more. Oh, and so that we're clear and I don't accidentally offend someone, I don't really think that. It was a joke, as bad as it was. So let's get over it. Anyway, coming back to those clones of you, you gotta Pokemon them, so catch them all, destroy and regain your life energy. As you start the game, real you, and not Bob Morlock you, there's only 5 of these left to find. Given how vast and alien the universe is, however, the task is neither easy nor one you could complete quickly. Captain Blood is an open-ended first-person adventure game where most of the time will be spent gathering clues of whereabouts of your clones by traveling to distant planets and communicating with alien species. Since each of the aliens use their own language, the game features an interface of over 150 icons, each representing different basic and sometimes abstract concepts, and you have to arrange them in correct order to convey to aliens what you have in mind. It's an unusual and interesting idea, and one that I find rather unique and novel, not only for the time, but for gaming in general. Successful conversations may offer clues on your clone's locations or unlock access to new planets. Your health deteriorates over time, which affects the game's interface, making it more difficult to control. Every time you dispose of a clone, however, all the symptoms go away for a while. Everything about Captain Blood's design is unlike anything else I've seen. From the story, through plot, all the way to the gameplay mechanics and game's inner workings. It's one of a kind title, and one I am really keen on trying out at some point. New York Warriors is an 8-way scrolling top-down shoot-em-up in a post-apocalyptic New York setting, heavily influenced by the movie The Warriors from 1979. In a far-off future of 2014, New York is a lawless land, run by various gangs competing for power and control of the city. The Warriors are the last remnants of the law and order, and you as one of the new recruits have to battle your way through dangerous streets of NYC all the way to the World Trade Center to stop a nuclear device on top of the building from exploding. Each area you plow your way through disposing of bodies left and right is controlled by another gang, and they are all entirely different from one another. So, there are Ramboids, Samis, Assassins, Sluggers, Killer Clowns, Ganja and Bombers, each having distinctive looks and weapons that they use. The game is pure fun, even better in simultaneous two-player mode where you can both cover each other's backs, going through this gritty city overtaken by mayhem. And it's not unusual to have a screen full of bad guys with bullets flying seemingly everywhere and explosions all around. So yeah, that body of yours will be helpful as it gets hectic fast. Fortunately, there's a lot of weapons you'll find on your way, so running around with a rocket launcher or flamethrower spraying death all around will not be anything unusual. Sounds are what you'd expect from a shooter, but graphics are really good. Not unlike those seen in the arcades, with a lot of color and big fluidly animated sprites everywhere. Honestly, I could see it somewhere on the cabinet just sitting and waiting for someone to start dropping coins in. Overall, New York Warriors is a really fun game, perhaps not the best on the Amiga, but quality and content-wise easily on par with many of the arcade releases of the time. Persian Gulf Inferno is a side-scrolling action platformer. The terrorists captured world's largest oil reserve that for some reason seems to be held in a huge office complex building. Unless it's just a front and the tank itself is somewhere in the background. We'll never know. So, they captured it and they threatened to blow it up with an atomic bomb if their demands are not met. Don't you wonder how all those bad guys always seem to get their hands on an atomic bomb somehow? I mean, in most countries getting a bomb or a set of explosives of any kind is a challenge, and yet they somehow always have one or two of these bad boys down their sleeve. Curious. Anyway, the game is taking place in said huge building filled with armed bad guys to the brim, and they do nothing but seemingly just wait for you to show up. The complex is virtually a maze of floors and doors that you have to traverse through, surviving a constant onslaught of enemies, all to disarm the bomb. Thing is, you have to find it first, and the game gives you only a simple handgun, 2 pieces of explosives and 25 minutes to do so. No hints, no friendly tips or an advice, nothing. It is impossible to complete it on first attempt, so you'll have to play it at least few times to gradually learn and memorize the layout of the building, to finally complete the game at some point. Hopefully. While you may start with close to nothing, you'll be able to find better weapons soon, and they'll definitely help on your mission. So don't give up and persevere. Persian Gulf Inferno feels to me like a newer version of Impossible Mission, but with terrorists instead of robots and doors in place of furniture you had to go through in each room like crazy. It is however considerably more demanding and tackles a more serious issue. But what everyone is really wondering, is it a better game? Well, since it's in an Obscure Games video, chances are that it isn't. And sadly I concur. It's not a bad game, it's just unremarkable, and another one of those titles where the time limit will annoy me way too much to ever complete it. One thing I do like it about it though are the fluid animations for all the characters and gory shootouts. Ranks is a French game loosely based on an Italian comic book, specifically Ranks Xerox in America. A mysterious psychoplague from space has spread over the world and is killing people at a rapid pace. There's no vaccine, but luckily there's a cure. You, as a hardcore blue-lipped android, have to travel from Rome to New York with an antidote pill to save the POTUS. Now, what US president is doing in NYC when he's deadly ill, and why the pill has to be carried on foot by an android from Italy, is beyond the scope of my understanding. But that's what you gotta do and where you gotta go. And when you finally get there, you'll need to travel straight back to Rome to save your girlfriend, who's portrayed in the game as a dangerously young lassie. Oh my god, I just said lassie. What am I, like 90? Anyway, as you carry on with those aforementioned crazy tasks, you also have to figure out how to disarm the bomb that's been implanted in your head. Because that's what happened at some point too. I know, crazy. Ranks is a mature arcade adventure with beat-em-up gameplay and logic abandoned at the design stage. And you're the one to play it. You can pretty much hit and fight with anyone and anything you come across. I mean, you can even keep hitting a car time after time like there's no tomorrow if you'd like to, or kick a sausage dog. And while I don't condone either of the activities and there's no real reason for any of them, you can just do that. That said, you must be careful not to attack peaceful characters as they may be interacted with and some of them are necessary to progress within the game, because they may share a valuable plot-centric info. Even if said communication is simplified to just few icons for questioning, threatening, laughing and insulting the person you're talking to. Sounds are actually pretty good and graphics are nice, even if overly bloody at times. But the jerky animation and flick scrolling are not something I'd expect from an Amiga. Still, while Ranks may be riding the crimson-colored wave of brutality, as it's probably the only Amiga title in which you can actually beat someone to a bloody pulp, it's not a great game, and at times feels repeatable. The fact that it's actually really difficult to did not encourage potential players, and it remained largely unknown. Soldier 2000 is a mixed-type shooter in which you play as a female Special Forces agent, saving hostages and killing terrorists. And yeah, it seems that today's video has been entirely overtaken by the terrorist themes. Oh well, what can you do? It is what it is. Anyway, the game is composed out of 5 missions, and before each you're arming your girl agent to the teeth, picking and matching guns and explosives big and small to make her into a small bipedal tank. Keep in mind, however, of the weight limitations and that each weapon requires you also to load ammo. I mean, it does not if you just want to keep it as a souvenir, but during shootouts it's crucial to be prepared. Each mission starts in a side-scrolling to the corridor where enemies may come from left and right and you gotta mutilate them with your weaponry, leaving blobs of red all around. This section of the game is considerably easier, but you're also not going to find many hostages to free in it. And by that, I mean none. So there's doors. Yeah, and going through those sets you off on a second part of the mission, Operation Wolf-like shooting. These are considerably more demanding, enemies come from seemingly everywhere and there's way more of them at once than in a side-scrolling bits. But there's more hostages there too, so the reason you're in this kerfuffle in the first place. The pictorial representation at the bottom of the screen shows your girl and her physical status, so it's worth keeping an eye on it, so she does not die. If she does unfortunately die, you can always send another one to complete the mission. So yeah, you guessed right, they are de facto your lives in the game. All in all, while the presentation of Soldier 2000 is not bad, even if a bit grotesque at times, it's not jaw-dropping either. And the gameplay is meh at best, so unless you're a hardcore fan of shooters, I wouldn't go out of your way to track it down. Weird Dreams is an unusual, surrealistic action puzzle game infamous for its bizarre plot and frustrating difficulty. Kinda like I am. Frustrating, that is, for constantly and needlessly going off topic. Just like I am now here. Anyway, essentially Weird Dreams is a collection of minigames that you have to beat to find 4 orbs. Gameplay manual comes in handy here though, as it highlights the story behind your motivation in detail. In short, to summarize it, you're basically a patient on an operating table with a demon trapped in your subconsciousness, and you need those 4 aforementioned orbs to escape, with both your life and sanity intact. The minigames are a collection of Deli-inspired dark horror tasks that often require impeccable timing and ungodly precision to pull off, so prepare to be annoyed while replaying them. And they can be any manner of unusual task, like feeding a wasp a cotton candy, beating up popping totem poles with a fish, or even an encounter with a baked chicken in a haunted house. You know, your everyday loony activities. Now, in those videos that I make, I often tend to go on rants that sometimes seem like I'm bordering on a thin line between sanity and madness. I do, and I know it. But Weird Dreams? Oh my days, it crosses the border with a big swoop in like first 10 minutes and never even gets close to it again. It seems crazy, it feels crazy, it looks crazy, and it's crazy tough. It is crazy. It's also an unusual game, unlike most you'll ever get to experience, so if you like those kinds of unknown little oddities, there's hardly any better to track down and play. Dynasty Wars is an awful game. No, scratch that. Dynasty Wars is an amazing side-scrolling arcade beat-em-up that happens to have one of the worst conversions to the Amiga ever. there's not many games as badly ported to the system, lacking in basically everything other than the graphics, which in itself are not that great either, but would be acceptable if the rest of the game was fine. Which is not the case here sadly, but we'll get to that in a little while. Anyway, the game is set in the Three Kingdoms era of Chinese history and allows you to pick one of 4 different fighters, each with their unique weapon. Zhang Fei fights with a halberd, Liu Bei with broadsword, Guang Yo with Guang Dao, it's a type of Chinese pole weapon apparently, and finally Zhao Yun that uses pike. Each of those fighters feel entirely unique to play and starts with a different health and strength levels. They grow over time however as your chosen character levels up. While the enemies throughout the whole game overall are quite varied, they could really be divided into 3 simple groups: archers, infantry and bosses, with not much in between. As you fight your way through all these, you'll get to collect treasure for points, food to replenish your health, and yellow and blue orbs. First is your experience points that raise your health at the level completion, and second upgrades your weapon. Every 3 blue orbs you gain access to a better one. I realized that all of that actually sounds pretty fun, but believe me, while the arcade original was, Amiga version is subpar at best. The graphics seem to be limited to only 16 colors and not standard for the System 32, and don't quote me on that, but it has a certain distinctive stench of a botched Atari ST conversion. I've no proof of that or otherwise, but that usually was the case back then when Amiga game was quite bad and a similar one was available earlier on the ST. Sadly, that's not all. The screen does not scroll, it jerks, characters move either if they were knee-deep in mud or moonwalk. The animations leave a lot to be desired when it comes to fluidity too. Overall, it's a hot mess and that's probably why it's such a little known title today on the Amiga. The only good thing I can think of really is that it offers a simultaneous 2-player mode. So if you're in a masochistic/sadistic mood and want someone else to experience what you're feeling, fire it up. You'll both have an awful time. Star Rush and at Star Rush looks and sounds great, and it's a game that should work. Oh no, did I spoil the conclusion already? Well, don't skip to the next game just yet, as it may end up being interesting to you one way or another. On the surface, it's a side-scrolling shoot-em-up not unlike R-Type or Project X. There's 12 stages in 4 worlds, you fly from left to right shooting various sci-fi themed bodies, then there's the boss, and this is where the standard shoot-em-up tropes end, and Star Rush becomes its own thing. After the boss, which happens to actually be only an easier mid-level one, the game flips directions and you fly back from right to left, fighting an entirely different set of enemies just to face the real boss at the end of it. While some may say that it's unnecessary as the game could just very well carry on in the same direction, or even worse, it's cheap as it saved development time by reusing assets, but honestly, I think it's novel and not something you got to see back then often. If that's not creative enough for you, then what if I tell you that with each ship upgrade it gets bigger, becoming an easier target? Odd, right? But there's a reason for it. Simply put, in Star Rush there's no lives. Your ship is your life. And every time you get shot and would die in any other game, in Star Rush you'd evolve to a simpler version of your ship, eventually becoming a dude in a jetpack and finally within your last imaginary hit point a space soldier running on the ground. If you die in this form, it's game over. So if you thought that level flipping mechanic was interesting, this has got to take the cake, right? Star Rush with its lush graphical presentation, multi-level parallaxing and 2-player mode should be one of the best shooters on the Amiga. Sadly, it's hard to say why, but the game is not very fun, at least to me. Sure, I can play a game or two once in a while, but it's not a title I'd keep restarting to complete in one sitting. Lupo Alberto is a side-scrolling platformer based on an Italian comic book. Also a game that's partly a cheat here on this list, as it was actually quite well known and popular in Italy and Germany out of all places. Other than that, at least to my knowledge, it's rather unknown. You play as Lupo, a shy and sensitive wolf, who wants nothing more from life than to spend some quality one-on-one time with his girlfriend Marta, the hen. Yeah, a wolf and a hen. So, you have to guide both Lupo and Marfa to a secluded location in each of the 10 levels so that they could make some sweet interspecies love. The spawn of this weird couple will no doubt be something for the books, if and only if they ever manage to get some alone time. Now, introduction aside, for all intents and purposes, Lupo Alberto is more or less a Mario clone. Well, not as strict a clone perhaps, but a game heavily inspired by it. You run from left to right, jumping on platforms and avoiding or killing any and all enemies by jumping on their heads. They drop bonuses and upgrades, which can be picked up to better your character. And while it may sound like a scene it carry on moment here, the game is actually pretty addictive and fun to play. Especially if you grab a friend and he, or better yet she, joins in and you get to platform your way through this madness together in simultaneous multiplayer. Graphically, Lupo and all the characters in the game are actually pretty nice and nothing I would have ever complained about. But the backgrounds and animations are of a bit lower quality than I'd like them to be. The first are rather simple and sometimes feeling bland, and the second feature 2-3 frames of animation per character at best, so it feels sometimes as if they were jerking between two different states. It's not something to detract you from playing, but definitely it sticks out like a sore. Well, we may need a more retro-inspired saying here. Let's see. It sticks out like an uncapped disk drive eject button. Better. Pegasus is, or rather was, three things. For one, it was a mythical creature, a winged horse to be precise, not taking into account laws of physics and how he would turn in the air, but whatever. Somehow it could fly. For second, and even more important, but still not the subject of this video, Pegasus was the name of the most popular NES clone in Poland in the late 80s. It usually came with a cartridge preloaded with at the very least 100 games and took a dozen or so of various shapes and forms, never looking anything like the real thing. And lastly and finally, what we're going to be talking about here, Pegasus is an Amiga side-scrolling action game mixing shoot-em-up with simple beat-em-up platforming not unlike those of Rastan and Rygar. Story-wise, the Satan has spread chaos and destruction in the world and it seems like there's nothing and no one that could stop him. Being the badass hero that you are, you volunteer and decide to rid the earth of this demonic plague. The game is composed out of 5 worlds, each containing 10 levels. Half of you play as a shoot-em-up in a beautiful parallax scrolling setting and a decent if not great weapon upgrade system. The other half is played on foot, kinda like two aforementioned platforming classics, where you lead your hero annihilating anything and everything you come across with your trusty sword. As you play, you'll collect diamonds that will be utmost helpful on your quest, allowing you for both purchase of upgrades and to be spent as a sort of last resort healing. Both parts of the game are fine, really, and play quite well too, but they lack that it factor that would have made you come back to it time after time despite the unsuccessful attempts. I feel that if the game was split in two and each of those parts would get another layer of polish in form of perhaps few extra development months, and then both would be released as separate games, we would have two classic titles today, and not one that's entirely forgotten. Toasty! If you ever wondered how a budget version of Lotus Turbo Challenge would look like, wonder no more. I'm here to show you. In fact, I'll show you how a discounted budget version would end up looking. Ride przez Polskę, which roughly translates to a race through Poland, is a 1996 arcade racer that sees you driving from one end of Poland to another, with individual routes spread between country's major cities. All within the allotted time limit, obviously. While the background graphics between the stages change a little, they don't feel very imaginative and are rather bland. Same can be said about the on-road traffic. There's only 3 different kinds of cars that you'll ever get to meet, and they're the same ones that you can pick to drive yourself. And these are Fiat Cinquecento, Fiat 126p, and Polonez Caro. And if you haven't heard of some of these, it's because they were, well, at least one of them was, nearly entirely exclusive to Poland and not sold anywhere else. While it's an interesting choice, I mean, you would not typically see cars like that in a standard racers, they were hardly machines that anyone would correlate with racing, with mostly tiny engines and low bhp. It could obviously be argued that the game was based on an earlier title, namely Cross Country Road Race, and was supposed to be a racer as well as teach geography of Poland, but quite honestly, while the subject itself may be interesting to some, the way this game presented it was beyond dull. In short, Ride przez Polskę sounds bad, looks terrible and plays mid. It's not a game I would recommend to anyone other than the avid racing fan, so that they could just add it to their collection and keep box unwrapped forever and ever. All that said, I can understand and appreciate the melancholy factor it may serve to those who played it back then and or come from Poland. Personally, I don't care about it much, it's just not good. First time I learned about the Shepherd was through a gaming mag back in the early 90s. It was not a review or even a proper preview, but literally just a paragraph, 4 or 5 sentences long. That was it. But it's that lack of any real detail about it and the fact that it was a shareware title and not a game readily available for purchase is what enchanted me. I couldn't get my paws on it and imagined scenarios of what the game may be about and how it may end up playing. Now, not gonna lie to you, what I imagined and what the game was entirely different. It doesn't mean that the game was bad in any shape or form, just not that what I hoped it would be. In short, The Shepherd is a game that's most similar to titles like Powermonger, Genesia or Populous, in that it's a real-time strategy with very intertwined and enjoyable god mechanics that eventually end up feeling a bit repeatable. You're a red god that has to defeat the blue one. And you do that by progressing and expanding your circle of life so that your strongest animals overcome those of your enemy. While you start with some trees and bushes, a few herbivores and a basic carnivore in the form of a wolf, you'll unlock more dangerous and stronger animals as you play. Your aim is to create a working and self-sustaining environment that's going to be capable of supporting more and more advanced animals that then themselves can be used to attack the opposing god's creatures. If that's not enough, you have divine powers in your literal hand that you can use for the task of besting your enemy too, so spawning volcanoes or lightning strikes is not unusual and something you'll use often. Sure, I might have oversimplified the game a little bit, but in the end it all comes down to eat or be eaten. And if you've got anything to say about it, you should always choose to eat. For the longest time I thought that Mean Machine was only ever released on Commodore 64. Same as for nearly 5 years between the ages of 24 and 29, I was convinced that I was 24 and never even gave it a second thought. Whenever there was a form to fill or anyone asked, I just said 24 not even thinking about it. It was a reflex reply and not something that I actively processed. I just said, typed that in and carried on with my day. Only when I reached 29 I accidentally kinda realized the truth, when talking to someone and they pointed out that they were 27 and younger than me, so I couldn't have been 24. The math just did not work. So I took out my mental calculator, meaning all 10 of my digits, and added the years, removed something, as you do, and then carried the 7. I mean, I did a lot of number juggling then, details are unnecessary, you get the gist of it. And the conclusion was clear. For 5 years I lived a lie, and the time effectively stood still for me. Anyway, coming back to our game, as I once more got lost in the memories of my yester-youth, Mean Machine is a top-down single-player Formula 2 racer where you drive on 4 crazy trucks, jumping on ramps, overtaking mad opponents, shooting rockets and spilling oil behind you to get them off your back. It's an action-filled simple little racer that never rose to the ranks of likes of Micro Machines or Lotus series of games because of its disappointing length and budget release method. The game can be finished in roughly 3 to 4 hours tops, and while it may seem that the budget label may have been easier to access by more players, it was also often associated with shorter and lower quality games. And not for no reason. Would I recommend Mean Machine today? Actually, despite all I just said, I would, but as one of few games for your retro evening rotation, as it's pretty fun little racer to lose yourself in every now and then for a minute or two. Street Racer is a late 1997 port of 1994's original release on Super Nintendo. It was advertised as a mix between Mario Kart and Street Fighter that combined fast-paced, adrenaline-fueled racing with blood pressure-raising beat-em-up influenced violence. The game offers up to 4 players multiplayer, 8 different vehicles and drivers to choose from, all with their own stats of speed, acceleration, handling, attack and defense, and a whole plethora of power-ups that are collectible during racing. And finally, a special unique attack, 1 per driver. There are also a few gameplay options to pick between. A soccer mode, which is kinda similar but incredibly simplified version of now well-known Rocket League, a rumble mode, where players drive around the circular track smacking each other into the sidewalls, then the championship mode, where you race and have to end up in the top 4 to qualify for the next track, and head-to-head, which is just 1v1 racing. All of that sounds pretty cool, right? Wrong. Because while the idea was definitely there and worked quite well on the original system, the conversion to the Ami left a rotten fish aftertaste. As if the freshly caught Super Nintendo fish was put aside for a few years, to rot from within, and then served on Amiga platter with no care put either to presentation or taste. It looked and played like a rotten fish. I mean, I never played with a rotten fish, but I imagine a Monty Python sketch where they fight with fish, and one is just rotten and falls apart into 1,000 smelly, gooey, slimy pieces after hitting one of the opponents. It was a fish fight, true, but not one you hoped for after watching Monty Python. Same here, it's a racing/fighting game, true, but way too much was lost in translation and not enough attention was put into details and mechanics to have it end up being a decent game. The animation is jerky, the controls are something else and require time and effort to master, and I would appreciate sound and music more if they were not present in the game at all. It's not one of the worst games on the Amiga, but it's an opportunity lost as the original was much more polished and overall much better. If we were to go by the number of copies sold alone, Boppin would be a definition of obscure on the Amiga. It only ever sold 284 original copies. I bet there were at least 10 times as many pirated ones circling around, but it's still nothing as compared to any other average Amiga game. Bopping is a puzzle game viewed from the side like your everyday platformer, with levels composed mostly of blocks, elevators and refractors. The gameplay is based on throwing blocks that you pick from your starting point at the blocks of the same type in the game field.
when after throwing a block special shape is formed with blocks of the same type, so a 3x2 square, 3x3 cross, 3x3 hollow square and 3x3 square, the monster hidden within the block is freed from captivity. At the end of the level, bonus points are awarded for freed monsters. Because that's what you do in Bopin, you don't save damsels in distress, princesses or entrapped kids, but monsters. You start the game with 5 lives and can never have any more than 10. Each wrong throw that ends up with your block destroyed costs you 1 life, so be careful and plan ahead. Every 40 levels there's a boss stage that has gameplay rules changed slightly. Bopin can be played by 2 players simultaneously, it's not a cooperative play however, but rather competitive one for points. Sadly, what Bopin was most known for, if you could say that about the game that haven't even sold 300 copies, was the obscene death animations, when upon losing a life, player characters would shoot themselves in the mouth or perform seppuku. Definitely not something parents would expect from a puzzle game that they bought for their kids. And that's why the 2.0 version was released at some point. It hit all the gruesome elements behind the command line parameter. An average intelligence ape could figure it out, but here you go, it was enough to calm down parents. At least the couple dozen of them that haven't bought the first release. All that said, Amiga version of the game offered 150 levels, a level editor and 3 difficulties to choose from. Why it never gained popularity is beyond my understanding, as it's actually a really playable and fun title. So, how do you like today's episode? Did at least few of these games were something you never knew of? Any of them looking interesting or something you'd like to try out? Make sure to let me know, and come back to watch the next video, which you know, may very well drop tomorrow or in a week. My schedule, same as my personality, is a random mess. But if you subscribe and 70% of you sadly are not, then you always get the new video in your subs box when it drops. Even better, if you ring-a-ding that bell down there, YouTube will send you a friendly notification when the next one's out, so think about it. If you feel generous and would like to support my channel, I'd appreciate Patreon and YouTube memberships. They really help a lot and will go towards replacing my aging editing rig. You will always also get access to new videos a day early. But if you can't or don't want to do that, likes and subscribes are great too. Most of all, however, I would like to take a second here and thank all the YouTube Let's Plays and playthrough creators, from whose videos short bits were taken for this one as a video background to my commentary. They are all amazing, and thanks to their efforts retro community can prevail for years longer and in better form than it could have otherwise. So thank you. For me though, this is all, so have a good one and I'll see you next time. Peace.